Hello everybody. We are trying something a little bit different tonight. This is not a music live stream, so if you're tuning in expecting to hear me sing, that's that's not happening tonight. This is a book reading live stream. I posted a couple of times over the last few days, sort of gauging to see if this is something that anybody else would have an interest in. I really like reading. I really like reading aloud. It's been a while since I've had anyone to do it for, and folks seem to be interested in hearing it. So a couple of other differences. I'm doing this feed through my OBS, which is what I usually use for Twitch TV and for my patron-only live streams. OBS lets me make actual recordings, which I can upload to my YouTube channel at Archive. So if I wind up having fun, if you guys wind up enjoying this, and I wind up doing more of these, if I wind up doing a bunch of these, you won't have to go rooting around, digging back through my Facebook page trying to find these. I'll have them all archived. I'll make up playlists for them so they'll be easily accessible. So you may notice that I'm a little bit lower down to the ground tonight. Usually when I'm doing a music live stream, I perch up here because it puts the guitar in line with the microphone, but it's not the most comfortable place to sit for really long sessions. So I've lowered everything down. I'm not using my tripod or anything. I've just kind of got the camera balanced on the edge of my table there. So the book that we'll be reading tonight is Pawn of Prophesy. So this is one of my favorite childhood novels. This is kind of what got me started off on fantasy. I mean, it's obviously not the first thing that I read or had read to me. That would probably be The Hobbit. Really kind of gave me a taste for fantasy novels. But this was probably the first one, and definitely the first series that I read as a kid. I was maybe 9 or 10 years old when I read through these for the first time. And this is actually the copy that I owned back then. I've had this since I was a little kid. So we're gonna see how well it holds up over the years. All right. Now, like I wrote in the write-up for this stream, I will be glancing at the comments every now and again, but I probably won't be responding to them except for like in between chapters. So middle of the chapters, I'm going to be focused, but we can maybe chat a little bit between chapters if you want. All right, here we go. Book 1 of the Belgariad, Pawn of Prophesy by David Eddings. For Theon, who told me stories but could not stay for mine, and for Arthur, who showed me the way to become a man and who shows me still. And there's a picture of the map of the world. I don't know if you can make it out very well, but there it is. Prologue. Being a history of the War of the Gods and the acts of Belgarath the Sorcerer, adapted from the Book of Alorn. When the world was new, the 7 gods dwelt in harmony, and the races of man were as one people. Balar, youngest of the gods, was beloved by the Alorns. He abode with them and cherished them, and they prospered in his care. The other gods also gathered peoples about them, and each god cherished his own people. But Balar's eldest brother, Aldur, was god over no people. He dwelt apart from men and gods, until the day that a vagrant child sought him out. Aldur accepted this child as his disciple and called him Belgarath. Belgarath learned the secret of the will and the word, and became a sorcerer. In the years that followed, others also sought out the solitary god. They joined in brotherhood to learn at the feet of Aldur, and time did not touch them. Now it happened that Aldur took up a stone in the shape of a globe, no larger than the heart of a child, and he turned the stone in his hand until it became a living soul. The power of the living jewel, which men called the Orb of Aldur, was very great, and Aldur worked wonders with it. Of all the gods, Torak was the most beautiful, and his people were the Angaraks. They burned sacrifices before him, calling him the Lord of Lords, and Torak found the smell of sacrifice and the words of adoration sweet. The day came, however, when he heard of the Orb of Aldur, and from that moment he knew no peace. Finally, in a dissembling guise, he went to Aldur. "My brother," he said, "it is not fitting that thou shouldst absent thyself from our company and council. Put aside this jewel which hath seduced thy mind from our fellowship." Aldur looked into his brother's soul and rebuked him. "Why dost thou seek lordship and dominion, Torak? Is not Angarak enough for thee? Do not in thy pride seek to possess the orb lest it slay thee. Great was Torak's shame at the words of Aldur, and he raised his hand and smote his brother. Taking the jewel, he fled. The other gods besought Torak to return the orb, but he would not. Then the races of man rose up and came against the hosts of Angarak and made war on them. The wars of the gods and men raged across the land until, near the high places of Korim, Torak raised the orb and forced its will to join with his to split the earth asunder. The mountains were cast down, and the sea came in. But Balar and Aldur joined their wills and set limits upon the sea. The races of man, however, were separated one from the others, and the gods also. Now when Torak raised the living orb against the earth, its mother, it awoke and began to glow with holy flame. The face of Torak was seared by the blue fire. In pain he cast down the mountains. In anguish he cracked open the earth. In agony he let in the sea. His left hand flared and burned to ashes. The flesh on the left side of his face melted like wax, and his left eye boiled in its socket. With a great cry he cast himself into the sea to quench the burning, but his anguish was without end. When Torak rose from the water, his right side was still fair, but his left was burned and scarred hideously by the fire of the orb. In endless pain he led his people away to the east, where they built a great city on the plains of Meloria, which they called Cthal Mishrak, City of Night, for Torak hid his maiming in darkness. The Angaraks raised an iron tower for their god, and placed the orb in an iron cask in the topmost chamber. Often Torak stood before the cask, then fled weeping, lest his yearning to look on the orb overpower him and he perish utterly. The centuries rolled past in the lands of the Angarak, and they came to call their maimed god Kal-Torak, both king and god. Balar had taken the Alorns to the north. Of all men they were the most hardy and warlike, and Balar put eternal hatred for Angarak in their hearts. With cruel swords and axes they ranged the north, even to the fields of eternal ice, seeking a way to their ancient enemies. Thus it was until the time when Sherrick Bareshoulders, greatest king of the Alorns, travelled to the Vale of Aldur to seek out Belgarath the sorcerer. "The way to the north is open," he said. "The signs and the auguries are propitious. Now the time is ripe for us to discover the way to the City of Night and regain the orb from One Eye." Poledra, wife of Belgarath, was great with child, and he was reluctant to leave her. But Sherrick prevailed. They stole away one night to join Sherrick's sons, Draz Bullneck, Algar Fleetfoot, and Riva Irongrip. Cruel winter gripped the Northland, and the moors glittered beneath the stars with frost and steel-grey ice. To seek out their way, Belgarath cast an enchantment, and took the shape of Great Wolf. On silent feet, he slunk through the snow-floored forests, where the trees cracked and shattered in the sundering cold. Grim frost silvered the ruff and shoulders of the wolf, and ever after the hair and beard of Belgarath were silver. Through snow and mist they crossed into Meloria, and came at last to Cthal Mishrak. Finding a secret way into the city, Belgarath led them to the foot of the iron tower. Silently they climbed the rusted stairs which had known no step for 20 centuries. Fearfully they passed through the chamber where Torak tossed in pain-haunted slumber, his maimed face hidden by a steel mask. Stealthily they crept past the sleeping god in the smouldering darkness, and came at last to the chamber where lay the iron cask, in which rested the living orb. Sherrick motioned for Belgarath to take the orb, but Belgarath refused. "I may not touch it," he said, "lest it destroy me. Once it welcomed the touch of man or god, but its will hardened when Torak raised it against its mother. It won't be used so again. It reads our souls. Only one without ill intent, who is pure enough to take it and convey it in peril of his life, with no thought of power or possession, may touch it now." "What man has no ill intent in the silence of his soul?" Sherrick asked. But Riva Irongrip opened the cask, and took up the orb. Its fire shone through his fingers, but he wasn't burned. "So be it, Sherrick," Belgarath said. "Your youngest son is pure. It shall be his doom and the doom of all who follow him to bear the orb and protect it." And Belgarath sighed, knowing the burden he'd placed upon Riva. "Then his brothers and I will sustain him," Sherrick said, "for so long as this doom is upon him." Riva muffled the orb in his cloak and hid it beneath his tunic. They crept again through the chambers of the maimed god, down the rusted stairs, along the secret way to the gates of the city and into the wasteland beyond. Soon after, Torak awoke and went as always into the chamber of the orb, but the cask stood open, and the orb was gone. Horrible was the wrath of Kal-Torak. Taking his great sword, he went down from the iron tower and turned and smote it once, and the tower fell. To the Angaraks he cried out in a voice of thunder, Because you are become indolent and unwatchful, and let a thief steal that which I paid for so dearly, I will break your city and drive you forth. Angarak shall wander the earth until Cathrag Yaska, the burning stone, is returned to me." Then he cast down the city of night in ruins, and drove the host of Angarak into the wilderness. Cathal Mishrak was no more. 3 leagues to the north, Belgarath heard the wailing from the city and knew that Torek had awakened. "Now he'll come after us," he said, "and only the power of the orb can save us. When the hosts are upon us, Iron Grip, take the orb and hold it so they may see it." The hosts of Angarak came, with Torek himself in the forefront, but Riva held forth the orb so that the maimed god and his hosts might behold it. The orb knew its enemy, its hatred flamed anew, and the sky became alight with its fury. Torek cried out and turned away. The front ranks of the Angarak hosts were consumed by fire, and the rest fled in terror. Thus Belgarath and his companions escaped from Meloria, and passed again through the marches of the north, bearing the orb of Aldur once more into the kingdoms of the west. Now the gods, knowing all that had passed, held council, and Aldur advised them. "If we raise war again upon our brother Torek, our strife will destroy the world. Thus we must absent ourselves from this world, so that our brother may not find us. No longer in flesh, but in spirit only, may we remain to guide and protect our people. For the world's sake it must be so. In the day that we war again, the world will be unmade." The gods wept that they must depart, but Shaldan, bull god of the Erins, asked, "In our absence, shall not Torek have dominion?" "Not so," Eldur replied. "So long as the orb remains with the line of Riva Irongrip, Torek shall not prevail." So it was that the gods departed, and only Torak remained, but the knowledge that the orb in the hands of Riva denied him dominion cankered his soul. Then Belgarath spoke with Sherrick and his sons. "Here we must part, to guard the orb and to prepare against the coming of Torak. Let each turn aside as I've instructed, and make preparations." "We will, Belgarath," vowed Sherrick bare shoulders. "From this day Eloria is no more, but the Alorns will deny dominion to Torak as long as one Alorn remains." Belgarath raised his face. "Hear me, Torak One-Eye," he cried. "The living orb is secure against thee, and thou shalt not prevail against it. In the day that thou comest against us, I shall raise war against thee. I will maintain watch upon thee by day and by night, and will abide against thy coming even to the end of days." In the wastelands of Meloria, Kaltorak heard the voice of Belgarath and smote about him in fury, for he knew that the living orb was forever beyond his reach. Then Sherrick embraced his sons and turned away, to see them no more. Dras went north and dwelt in the lands drained by the river Marin. He built a city at Boktor and called his lands Drasnia. And he and his descendants stood athwart the northern marches and denied them to the enemy. Algar went south with his people and found horses upon the broad plains drained by the Aldur River. The horses they tamed and learned to ride for the first time in the history of man. Mounted warriors appeared. Their country they called Algaria, and they became nomads, following their herds. Sherrick returned sadly to Val-Alorn, and renamed his kingdom Sherrick, for now he was alone and without sons. Grimly he built tall ships of war to patrol the seas and deny them to the enemy. Upon the bearer of the orb, however, fell the burden of the longest journey. Taking his people, Riva went to the west coast of Sendaria. There he built ships, and he and his people crossed to the Isle of the Winds. They burned their ships and built a fortress and a walled city around it. The city they called Riva, and the fortress of the Hall of the Riven King. Then Belar, god of the Alorns, caused 2 iron stars to fall from the sky. Riva took up the stars, and forged a blade from one and a hilt from the other, setting the orb upon it as a pommel stone. So large was the sword that none but Riva could wield it. In the wasteland of Meloria, Kaltorak felt in his soul the forging of the sword, and he tasted fear for the first time. The sword was set against the black rock that stood at the back of Riva's throne, with the orb at the highest point, and the sword joined to the rock so that none but Riva could remove it. The orb burned with a cold fire when Riva sat upon the throne, and when he took down his sword and raised it, it became a great tongue of cold fire. The greatest wonder of all was the marking of Riva's heir. In each generation, one child in the line of Riva bore upon the palm of his right hand the mark of the orb. The child so marked was taken to the throne chamber, and his hand was placed upon the orb so that it might know him. With each infant touch, the orb waxed in brilliance, and the bond between the living orb and the line of Riva became stronger with each joining. After Belgarath had parted from his companions, he hastened to the Vale of Aldur, but there he found that Poledra, his wife, had borne twin daughters and then had died. In sorrow, he named the elder Polgera. Her hair was dark, dark as the raven's wing. In the fashion of sorcerers, he stretched forth his hand to lay it upon her brow, and a single lock at her forehead turned frost-white at his touch. Then he was troubled, for the white lock was the mark of the sorcerers, and Polgara was the first female child to be so marked. His second daughter, fair-skinned and golden-haired, was unmarked. He called her Beldaran, and he and her dark-haired sister loved her beyond all else, and contended with each other for her affection. Now when Polgara and Beldaran had reached their 16th year, the spirit of Aldur came to Belgarath in a dream, saying, "My beloved disciple, I would join thy house with the house of the guardian of the orb. Choose, therefore, which of thy daughters thou wilt give to the Riven King to be his wife and the mother of his line. For in that line lies the hope of the world, against which the dark power of Torak may not prevail." In the deep silence of his soul, Belgarath was tempted to choose Polgara, but knowing the burden which lay upon the Riven King, he sent Beldaran instead, and wept when she was gone. Polgara wept also, long and bitterly, knowing that her sister must fade and die. In time, however, they comforted each other and came at last to know each other. They joined their powers to keep watch over Torak, and some men say they abide still, keeping their vigil through all the uncounted centuries. You'll forgive me if I tear up or choke up a little bit. There's a lot of bits in these books that really strike an emotional place for me. It's, as I said, it's the first major fantasy series that I ever really read as a child, so there's a lot kind of bound up in there, and I know a lot of the ideas that are in this book he borrows really heavily. You can see a lot of Tolkien in here, a lot of Lord of the Rings, a lot of kind of King Arthur stuff as well, in his inspirations. So a lot of the stuff in these books isn't particularly original, but it was my first exposure to a lot of it. So it really it's really kind of sentimental to me. So at least until I get my my reading legs under me again, expect a little bit of funny faces and choked up reading on my part. Thus ends the prologue, and starts Part 1, Sendaria. Oh, I should scroll down quickly and see if there are any comments I need to talk to. Do I want? No, thank you for the offer, Robin. I do not want pizza. I've got more food in the fridge than I can really comfortably eat right now. Really appreciate the offer, but tonight it would just wind up going to waste. It would be like 3 days before I would get around to eating it. All right, looks like that was the only question. So now we're going to get on with Chapter 1. And here is a. Let me bring up the camera again. Here is a map of a blurry map of Sendaria and the Gulf of Sherek. Chapter 1. The first thing the boy Garion remembered was the kitchen at Faldor's farm. For the rest of his life he had a special warm feeling for kitchens, and those peculiar sounds and smells that seemed somehow to combine into a bustling seriousness that had to do with love and food, and comfort, and security, and above all, home. No matter how high Garion rose later in life, he never forgot all of his memories began in that kitchen. The kitchen at Faldor's farm was a large, low-beamed room filled with ovens and kettles and great spits that turned slowly in cavern-like arched fireplaces. There were long, heavy work tables where bread was kneaded into loaves, and chickens were cut up, and carrots and celery were diced, with quick, crisp rocking movements of long, curved knives. When Garion was very small, he played under those tables, and soon learned to keep his fingers and toes out from under the feet of the kitchen helpers who worked around them. And sometimes in the late afternoon, when he grew tired, he would lie in a corner and stare into one of the flickering fires that gleamed and reflected back from the 100 polished pots and knives and long-handled spoons that hung from pegs along the whitewashed walls. And, all bemused, he would drift off to sleep in perfect peace and harmony with all the world around him. The center of the kitchen and everything that happened there was Aunt Paul. She seemed somehow to be able to be everywhere at once. The finishing touch that plumped a goose in its roasting pan or deftly shaped a rising loaf or garnished a smoking ham fresh from the oven was always hers. Though there were several others who worked in the kitchen, no loaf, stew, soup, roast, or vegetable ever went out of it that had not been touched at least once by Aunt Paul. She knew by smell, taste, or some higher instinct what each dish required, and she seasoned them all by pinch or trace or a negligent-seeming shake from earthenware spice pots. It was as if there was a kind of magic about her, a knowledge and power beyond that of ordinary people. And yet, even at her busiest, she always knew precisely where Garine was. In the very midst of crimping a pie crust, or decorating a special cake, or stitching up a freshly stuffed chicken, she could, without looking, reach out a leg and hook him back out from under the feet of others with heel or ankle. As he grew a bit older, it even became a game. Garine would watch until she seemed far too busy to notice him, and then laughing he would run on his sturdy little legs toward a door, but she would always catch him, and he would laugh and throw his arms around her neck and kiss her, and then go back to watching for his next chance to run away again. He was quite convinced in those early years that his Aunt Paul was quite the most important and beautiful woman in the world. For one thing, she was taller than the other women on Faldor's farm, very nearly as tall as a man, and her face was always serious, even stern, except with him, of course. Her hair was long and very dark, almost black, all but one lock just above her left brow, which was white as new snow. At night, when she tucked him into the little bed close beside her own in the private room above the kitchen, she would reach out and touch that white lock. She would smile at him and touch his face with a soft hand. Then he would sleep, content in the knowledge that she was there, watching over him. Faldor's farm lay very nearly in the centre of Sendaria, a misty kingdom bordered on the west by the Sea of the Winds and on the east by the Gulf of Sherrick. Like all farmhouses in that particular time and place, Faldor's farmstead was not one building or two, but rather was a solidly constructed complex of sheds and barns, and hen roosts and dovecotes, all facing inward upon a central yard with a stout gate at the front. Along the second-story gallery were the rooms, some spacious, some quite tiny, in which lived the farmhands who tilled and planted and weeded the extensive fields beyond the walls. Faldor himself lived in quarters in the square tower above the central dining hall, where his workers assembled 3 times a day, sometimes 4 during harvest time, to feast on the bounty of Aunt Paul's kitchen. All in all, it was a quite happy and harmonious place. Farmer Faldor was a good master. He was a tall, serious man with a long nose and an even longer jaw. Though he seldom laughed or even smiled, he was kindly to those who worked for him, and seemed more intent on maintaining them all in health and well-being than extracting the last possible ounce of sweat from them. In many ways, he was more like a father than a master to the 60-odd people who lived on the freeholding. He ate with them, which was unusual, since many farmers in the district sought to hold themselves aloof from their workers, and his presence at the head of the central table in the dining hall exerted a restraining influence on some of the younger ones, who tended sometimes to be boisterous. Farmer Faldor was a devout man, and he invariably invoked with simple eloquence the blessing of the gods before each meal. The people of his farm, knowing this, filed with some decorum into the dining hall before each meal and sat in the semblance, at least, of piety, before attacking the heaping platters and bowls of food that Aunt Paul and her helpers had placed before them. Because of Faldor's good heart and the magic of Aunt Paul's deft fingers, the farm was known throughout the district as the finest place to live and work for 20 leagues in any direction. Whole evenings were spent in the tavern of the nearby village of Upper Grault, in minute descriptions of the near miraculous meals served regularly in Faldor's dining hall. Less fortunate men who worked at other farms were frequently seen, after several pots of ale, to weep openly at the descriptions of one of Aunt Paul's roasted geese, and the fame of Faldor's farm spread wide throughout the district. The most important man on the farm, aside from Faldor, was Dernick the smith. As Garine grew older and was allowed to move out from under Aunt Paul's watchful eye, he found his way inevitably to the smithy. The glowing iron that came from Dernick's forge had an almost hypnotic attraction for him. Dernick was an ordinary-looking man with plain brown hair and a plain face, ruddy from the heat of the forge. He was neither tall nor short, nor was he thin or stout. He was sober and quiet, and like most men who follow his trade, he was enormously strong. He wore a rough leather jerkin and an apron of the same material. Both were spotted with burns from the sparks which flew from his forge. He also wore tight-fitting hose and soft leather boots, as was the custom in that part of Sendaria. At first, Dernick's only words to Garine were warnings to keep his fingers away from the forge and the glowing metal which came from it. In time, however, he and the boy became friends, and he spoke more frequently. "Always finish what you set your hand to," he would advise. "It's bad for the iron if you set it aside and then take it back to the fire more than's needful." "Why's that?" Garine would ask. Dernick would shrug. "It just is." Always do the very best job you can, he said on another occasion, as he put a few last finishing touches with a file on the metal parts of a wagon tongue he was repairing. But that piece goes underneath, Garion said. No one will ever see it. But I know it's there, Dernick said, still smoothing the metal. And if it isn't done as well as I can do it, I'll be ashamed every time I see this wagon go by. And I'm going to see this wagon every day. And so it went. Without even intending to, Dernick instructed the small boy in those solid Sandarian virtues of work, thrift, sobriety, good manners, and practicality which formed the backbone of the society. At first, Aunt Paul worried about Garion's attraction to the smithy with its obvious dangers, but after watching from her kitchen door for a while, she realized that Dernick was almost as watchful of Garion's safety as she was herself, and she became less concerned. If the boy becomes pestersome, Goodman Dernick, send him away, she told the smith on one occasion when he'd brought a large copper kettle to the smithy to be patched. Or tell me, and I'll keep him closer to the kitchen. He's no bother, Mistress Paul, Dernick said, smiling. He's a sensible boy, and he knows enough to keep out of the way. You're too good-natured, friend Dernick, Aunt Paul said. The boy's full of questions. Answer one and a dozen more pour out. That's the way of boys, Dernick said, carefully pouring bubbling metal into the small clay ring he placed around the tiny hole in the bottom of the kettle. I was questionsome myself when I was a boy. My father and old Barrel, the smith who taught me, were patient enough to answer what they could. I'd repay them poorly if I didn't have the same patience with Garion. Garion, who was sitting nearby, had held his breath during the conversation. He knew that one wrong word on either side would instantly banish him from the smithy. As Aunt Paul walked back across the hard-packed dirt of the yard toward her kitchen, with a new-mended kettle, he noticed the way that Dernick watched her, and an idea began to form in his mind. It was a simple idea, and the beauty of it was that it provided something for everyone. Aunt Paul, he said that night, wincing as she washed one of his ears with a rough cloth. Yes, she said, turning her attention to his neck. Why don't you marry Dernick? She stopped washing. What? She asked. I think it would be an awfully good idea. Oh, do you? Her voice had a slight edge to it, and Garion knew he was on dangerous ground. He likes you, he said defensively. And I suppose you've already discussed this with him? No, he said. I thought I'd talk to you about it first. At least that was a good idea. I can tell him about it tomorrow morning if you like. His head was turned around quite firmly by one ear, and Paul Garion found his ears far too convenient. Don't you so much as breathe one word of this nonsense to Dernick or anyone else, she said, her dark eyes burning into his with a fire he'd never seen there before. It was only a thought, he said quickly. A very bad one. From now on, leave thinking to grown-ups. She was still holding his ear. Anything you say, he agreed hastily. Later that night, however, when they lay in their beds in the quiet darkness, he approached the problem obliquely. Aunt Paul? Yes? Since you don't want to marry Dernick, whom do you want to marry? Garion, she said. Yes? Close your mouth and go to sleep. I think I've got a right to know, he said in an injured tone. Garion! All right, I'm going to sleep, but I don't think you're being very fair about all this. She drew in a deep breath. Very well, she said. I'm not thinking of getting married. I've never thought of getting married, and I seriously doubt I'll ever think of getting married. I have far too many important things to attend for any of that. Don't worry, Aunt Paul, he said, wanting to put her mind at ease. When I grow up, I'll marry you. She laughed then, a deep, rich laugh, and reached out to touch his face in the darkness. Oh no, my Garion, she said. There's another wife in store for you. Who? He demanded. You'll find out, she said mysteriously. Now go to sleep. Aunt Paul? Yes? Where's my mother? It was a question he'd been meaning to ask for quite some time. There was a long pause. Then Aunt Paul sighed. She died, she said quietly. Garion felt a sudden wrenching surge of grief, an unbearable anguish. He began to cry. And then she was beside his bed. She knelt on the floor and put her arms around him. Finally, a long time later, after she had carried him over to her own bed and held him close until his grief had run its course, Garion asked brokenly, What was she like, my mother? She was fair-haired, Aunt Paul said, and very young and beautiful. Her voice was gentle, and she was very happy. Did she love me? More than you could imagine. And then he cried again, but his crying was quieter now, more regretful than anguished. Aunt Paul held him closely until he cried himself to sleep. And here I go. There go the waterworks. There were other children on Faldor's farm, as was only natural in a community of 60 or so. The older ones on the farm all worked, but there were 3 other children of about Garion's age on the freeholding. These 3 became his playmates and his friends. The oldest boy was named Runderig. He was a year or 2 older than Garion and quite a bit taller. Ordinarily, since he was the eldest of the children, Runderig would have been their leader, but because he was an errand, his sense was a bit limited, and he cheerfully deferred to the younger ones. The kingdom of Sendaria, unlike other kingdoms, was inhabited by a broad variety of racial stocks. Sherricks, Algars, Drasnians, Erins, and even a substantial number of Tolnadrins had merged to form the elemental Sendar. Erins, of course, were very brave, but were also notoriously thick-witted. Garion's second playmate was Dorun, a small, quick boy whose background was so mixed that he could only be called a Sendar. The most notable thing about Dorun was the fact that he was always running. He never walked if he could run. Like his feet, his mind seemed to tumble over itself, and his tongue as well. He talked continuously and very fast, and he was always very excited. The undisputed leader of the little foursome was the girl Zubret, a golden-haired charmer who invented their games, made up stories to tell them, and set them to stealing apples and plums from Faldor's orchard for her. She ruled them as a little queen, playing one against the other and inciting them into fights. She was quite heartless, and each of the 3 boys at times hated her, even while remaining helpless thralls to her tiniest whim. In the winter, they slid on wide boards down the snowy hillside behind the farmhouse and returned home, wet and snow-covered, with chapped hands and glowing cheeks as evening's purple shadows crept across the snow. Or, after Dernick the smith had proclaimed the ice safe, they would slide endlessly across the frozen pond that lay glittering frostily in the little dale just to the east of the farm buildings along the road to Upper Grault. And if the weather was too cold or on toward spring when rains and warm winds had made the snow slushy and the pond unsafe, they would gather in the hay barn and leap by the hour from the loft into the soft hay beneath, filling their hair with chaff and their noses with dust that smelled of summer. In the spring they caught pollywogs along the marshy edges of the pond, and climbed trees, to stare in wonder at the tiny blue eggs the birds had laid in twiggy nests in the high branches. It was Doru, naturally, who fell from a tree and broke his arm one fine spring morning when Zubret urged them into the highest branches of a tree near the edge of the pond. Since Runderig stood helplessly gaping at his injured friend and Zubret had run away almost before he hit the ground, it fell to Garion to make certain necessary decisions. Gravely, he considered the situation for a few moments, his young face seriously intent beneath his shock of sandy hair. The arm was obviously broken, and Dorun, pale and frightened, bit his lip to keep from crying. A movement caught Garion's eye, and he glanced up quickly. A man in a dark cloak sat astride a large black horse not far away, watching intently. When their eyes met, Garion felt a momentary chill, and he knew that he'd seen the man before, that indeed that dark figure had hovered on the edge of his vision for as long as he could remember, never speaking, but always watching. There was in that silent scrutiny a kind of cold animosity, curiously mingled with something that was almost, but not quite, fear. Then Dorun whimpered, and Garion turned back. Carefully he bound the injured arm across the front of Dorun's body with his rope belt, and then he and Runderig helped the injured boy to his feet. "At least he could have helped us," Garion said resentfully. "Who?" Runderig said, looking around. Garion turned to point at the dark-cloaked man, but the rider was gone. "I didn't see anyone," Runderig said. "It hurts," Dorun said. "Don't worry," said Garion. "Aunt Paul will fix it." And so she did. When the 3 appeared at the door of her kitchen, she took in the situation with a single glance. "Bring him over here," she told them, her voice not even excited. She set the pale and violently trembling boy on a stool near one of the ovens and mixed a tea of several herbs taken from earthenware jars on a high shelf in the back of one of her pantries. "Drink this," she instructed Dorun, handing him a steaming mug. "Will it make my arm well?" Dorun asked, suspiciously eyeing the evil-smelling brew. "Just drink it," she ordered, laying out some splints and linen strips. "Ugh, it tastes awful," Dorun said, making a face. "It's supposed to," she told him. "Drink it all." "I don't think I want any more," he said. "Very well," she said. She pushed back the splints and took down a long, very sharp knife from a hook on the wall. "What are you going to do with that?" he demanded shakily. "Since you don't want to take the medicine," she said blandly, "I guess it'll have to come off." "Off!" Dorun squeaked, his eyes bulging. "Probably about right there," she said, thoughtfully touching his arm at the elbow with the point of the knife. Tears coming to his eyes, Dorun gulped down the rest of the liquid, and a few minutes later he was nodding, almost drowsing on his stool. He screamed once, though, when Aunt Paul set the broken bone, but after the arm had been wrapped and splinted, he drowsed again, and Aunt Paul spoke briefly with the boy's frightened mother, and then had Dernick carry him up to bed. You wouldn't really have cut off his arm, Garion said. Aunt Paul looked at him, her expression unchanging. Oh, she said, and he was no longer sure. I think I'd like to have a word with Mistress Zubrette now, she said then. She ran away when Durwin fell out of the tree, Garion said. Find her. She's hiding, Garion protested. She always hides when something goes wrong. I wouldn't know where to look for her. Garion, Aunt Paul said, I didn't ask if you knew where to look. I told you to find her and bring her to me. What if she won't come? Garion hedged. Garion! There was a note of awful finality in Aunt Paul's tone, and Garion fled. I didn't have anything to do with it, Zubrette lied as soon as Garion led her to Aunt Paul in the kitchen. You, Aunt Paul said, pointing at a stool. Sit. Zubrette sank onto the stool, her mouth open and her eyes wide. You, Aunt Paul said to Garion, pointing at the kitchen door. Out. Garion left hurriedly. 10 minutes later, a sobbing little girl stumbled out of the kitchen. Aunt Paul stood in the doorway looking after her with eyes hard as ice. Did you thrash her? Garion asked hopefully. Aunt Paul withered him with a glance. Of course not, she said. You don't thrash girls. I would have, Garion said, disappointed. What did you do to her? Don't you have anything to do? Aunt Paul asked. No, Garion said. Not really. That, of course, was a mistake. Good, Aunt Paul said, finding one of his ears. It's time you started to earn your way. You'll find some dirty pots in the scullery. I'd like to have them scrubbed. I don't know why you're angry with me, Garion objected, squirming. It wasn't my fault that Doran went up that tree. The scullery, Garion, now. The rest of that spring and the early part of the summer were quiet. Doran, of course, could not play until his arm mended, and Zubrette had been so shaken by whatever it was that Aunt Paul had said to her that she avoided the two other boys. Garion was left only with Runderig to play with, and Runderig wasn't bright enough to be much fun. Because there was really nothing else to do, the boys often went into the fields to watch the hands work and listen to their talk. As it happened, during that particular summer, the men of Faldor's farm were talking about the Battle of Volmimber, the most cataclysmic event in the history of the West. Garion and Runderig listened, enthralled, as the men unfolded the story of how the hordes of Kaltorak had quite suddenly struck into the West, some 500 years ago. It had all begun in 4865, as men reckoned time in that part of the world, when vast multitudes of Murgos and Nadraks and Thulls had struck down across the mountains of the eastern escarpment into Drasnia, and behind them in endless waves had come the uncountable numbers of the Malorians. After Drasnia had been brutally crushed, the Angaraks had turned southward onto the vast grasslands of Algaria, and had laid siege to that enormous fortress called the Algarian Stronghold. The siege had lasted for 8 years until finally, in disgust, Kaltorak had abandoned it. It wasn't until he turned his army westward into Ulgoland that the other kingdoms became aware that the Angarak invasion was not directed only against the Alorns but against all of the West. In the summer of 4875, Kaltorak had come down upon the Erendish plain before the city of Volmimbra, and it was there that the combined armies of the West awaited him. The Sendars who participated in the battle were a part of the force under the leadership of Brand, the Riven Warder. That force, consisting of Rivens, Sendars, and Asturian Erins, assaulted the Angarak rear after the left had been engaged by Algars, Drasnians, and Ulgos, the right by Tolnerdins and Shereks, and the front by the legendary charge of the Mimbraid Erins. For hours the battle had raged until, in the center of the field, Brand had met in a single combat with Kaltorak himself. Upon that duel had hinged the outcome of the battle. Although 20 generations had passed since that titanic encounter, it was still as fresh in the memory of the Sendarian farmers who worked on Faldor's farm as if it had happened only yesterday. Each blow was described, and each feint and parry. At the final moment, when it seemed that he must inevitably be overthrown, Brand had removed the covering from his shield, and Kaltorak, taken aback by some momentary confusion, had lowered his guard and been instantly struck down. For Runderig, the description of the battle was enough to set his Erendish blood seething. Garion, however, found that certain questions had been left unanswered by the stories. Why was Brand's shield covered? He asked Kralto, one of the older hands. Kralto shrugged. It just was, he said. Everyone I've ever talked with about it agrees upon that. Was it a magic shield? Garion persisted. It may have been, Kralto said, but I've never heard anyone say so. All I know is that when Brand uncovered his shield, Kaltorak dropped his own shield, and Brand stabbed his sword into Kaltorak's head, through the eye, or so I'm told. Garion shook his head stubbornly. I don't understand, he said. Why would something like that have made Kaltorak afraid? I can't say, Kralto told him. I've never heard anyone explain it. Despite his dissatisfaction with the story, Garion quite quickly agreed to Runderig's rather simple plan to reenact the duel. After a day or so of posturing and banging at each other with sticks to simulate swords, Garion decided they needed some equipment to make the game more enjoyable. 2 kettles and 2 large pot lids mysteriously disappeared from Aunt Paul's kitchen, and Garion and Runderig, now with helmets and shields, repaired to a quiet place to do war upon each other. It was all going quite splendidly until Runderig, who was older, taller, and stronger, struck Garion a resounding whack on the head with his wooden sword. The rim of the kettle cut into Garion's eyebrow, and the blood began to flow. There was a sudden ringing in Garion's ears, and a kind of boiling exultation surged up in his veins as he rose to his feet from the ground. He never knew afterward quite what happened. He had only sketchy memories of shouting defiance at Kaltorak, in words which sprang to his lips and which even he didn't understand. Runderig's familiar and somewhat foolish face was no longer the face before him, but rather was replaced by something hideously maimed and ugly. In a fury, Garion struck at that face again and again with fire seething in his brain. And then it was over. Poor Runderig lay at his feet, beaten senseless by the enraged attack. Garion was horrified at what he'd done, but at the same time there was the fiery taste of victory in his mouth. Later, in the kitchen, where all injuries on the farm were routinely taken, Aunt Paul tended their wounds with only minimal comments about them. Runderig seemed not to be seriously hurt, though his face had begun to swell and turn purple in several places, and he had difficulty focusing his eyes at first. A few cold claws on his head and one of Aunt Paul's potions quickly restored him. The cut on Garion's brow, however, required a bit more attention. She had Durnick hold the boy down, and then she took needle and thread and sewed up the cut, as calmly as she would have repaired a rip in a sleeve, all the while ignoring the howls from her patient. All in all, she seemed much more concerned about the dented kettles and battered pot lids than about the war wounds of the 2 boys. When it was over, Garion had a headache and was taken up to bed. At least I beat Kaltorak, he told Aunt Paul somewhat drowsily. She looked at him sharply. Where did you hear about Torak? She demanded. It's Kaltorak, Aunt Paul, Garion explained patiently. Answer me. The farmers were telling stories, old Krauto and the others, about Brand and Vonimber, and Kaltorak and all the rest. That's what Runderig and I were playing. I was Brand and he was Kaltorak. It didn't get to uncover my shield, though. Runderig hit me on the head before we got that far. I want you to listen to me, Garion, Aunt Paul said, and I want you to listen carefully. You're never to speak that name of Torak again. It's Kaltorak, Aunt Paul, Garion explained, not just Torak. Then she hit him, which she'd never done before. The slap across his mouth surprised him more than it hurt, for she didn't hit him very hard. You will never speak the name of Torak again. Never, she said. This is important, Garion. Your safety depends on it. I want your promise. You don't have to get so angry about it, he said in an injured tone. Promise. All right, I promise. It was only a game. A very foolish one, Aunt Paul said. You might have killed Runderig. What about me? Garion protested. You were never in any danger, she told him. Now go to sleep. And as he dozed fitfully, his head light from his injury and the strange bitter drink his aunt had given him, he seemed to hear her deep, rich voice saying, Garion, my Garion, you're too young yet. And later, rising from deep sleep as a fish rises slowly toward the silvery surface of the water, he seemed to hear her call, Father, I need you. Then he plunged again into a troubled sleep, haunted by a dark figure of a man on a black horse, who watched his every movement with a cold animosity and something that hovered very near the edge of fear. And beyond that dark figure he had always known to be there, but had never overtly acknowledged, even to Aunt Paul, the maimed and ugly face he had briefly seen or imagined in that fight with Runderig loomed darkly, like the hideous fruit of an unspeakably evil tree. Alright, that's the end of Chapter 1. Just going to scroll down and see if there are any comments or questions. Doesn't look like it. So we're going to continue right on with Chapter 2. As soon as I've properly wet my whistle. Chapter 2. Not long after, in the endless noon of Garion's boyhood, the storyteller appeared once again at the gate of Faldor's farm. The storyteller, who seemed not to have a proper name as other men do, was a thoroughly disreputable old man. The knees of his hose were patched and his mismatched shoes were out at his toes. His long-sleeved woolen tunic, was belted about his waist with a piece of rope, and his hood, a curious garment not normally worn in that part of Sandaria, and one which Garion thought quite fine, with its loosely fitting yoke covering his shoulders, back and chest, was spotted and soiled with spilled food and drink. Only his full cloak seemed relatively new. The old storyteller's white hair was cropped quite close, as was his beard. His face was strong with a kind of angularity to it, and his features provided no clue as to his background. He didn't resemble Erend nor Sherrick, Algor nor Drazian, Raven nor Tolnerdren, but seemed rather to derive from some racial stock long since forgotten. His eyes were a deep and merry blue, forever young and forever full of mischief. The storyteller appeared from time to time at Faldor's farm and was always welcome. He was, in truth, a rootless vagabond who made his way in the world by telling stories. His stories were not always new, but there was in his telling of them a special kind of magic. His voice could roll like thunder, or hush down into a zephyr-like whisper. He could imitate the voices of a dozen men at once, whistle so like a bird that the birds themselves would come to him to hear what he had to say, and when he imitated the howl of a wolf, the sound could raise the hair on the back of his listeners' necks, and strike a chill into the hearts like the depths of a Drazian winter. He could make the sound of rain, and of wind, and even, most miraculously, the sound of snow falling. His stories were filled with sounds that made them come alive, and through the sounds and the words with which he wove his tales, sight and smell and the very feel of strange times and places seemed also to come to life for his spellbound listeners. All of this wonder he gave freely in exchange for a few meals, a few tankards of ale, and a warm spot in the hay barn with which to sleep. He roamed about the world seemingly as free of possessions as the birds. Between the storyteller and Aunt Paul there seemed to be a sort of hidden recognition. She had always viewed his coming with a kind of wry acceptance, knowing, it seemed, that the ultimate treasures of her kitchen were not safe so long as he lurked in the vicinity. Loaves and cakes had a way of disappearing when he was around, and his quick knife, always ready, could neatly divest the most carefully prepared goose of a pair of drumsticks and a generous slab of breast meat with 3 swift slices when her back was turned. She called him Old Wolf, and his appearance at the gates of Faldor's farm marked the resumption of a contest which had obviously been going on for years. He flattered her outrageously even as he stole from her. Offered cookies or dark brown bread he would politely refuse, and then steal half a plateful before the platter had moved out of his reach. Her beer pantry and wine cellar might as well have been delivered into his hands immediately upon his appearance at the gate. He seemed to delight in pilferage, and if she watched him with a steely eye, he found quite easily a dozen confederates, willing to sack her kitchen in exchange for a single story. Lamentably, among his most able pupils was the boy Garion. Often, driven to distraction by the necessity of watching at once an old thief and a fledgling one, Aunt Paul would arm herself with a broom, and drive them both from her kitchen with hard words and resounding blows. And the old storyteller, laughing, would flee with the boy to some secluded place where they would feast on the fruits of their pilferage, and the old man, tasting frequently from a flagon of stolen wine or beer, would regale his student with stories out of the dim past. The best stories, of course, were saved for the dining hall, when, after the evening meal was over and the plates had been pushed back, the old man would rise from his place and carry his listeners off to a world of magical enchantment. "Tell us of the beginnings, my old friend," Faldor, always pious, said one evening, "and of the gods." "Of the beginnings and the gods," the old man mused. A worthy subject, Faldor, but a dry and a dusty one." "I've noticed that you find all subjects dry and dusty, old wolf," Aunt Paul said, going to the barrel and drawing off a tankard of foamy beer for him. He accepted the tankard with a stately bow. "It's one of the hazards of my profession, Mistress Paul," he explained. He drank deeply and set the tankard aside. He lowered his head in thought for a moment, then looked directly, or so it seemed, at Garion. And then he did a strange thing which he'd never done before when telling stories in Faldor's dining hall. He drew his cloak about him and rose to his full height. "Behold," he said, his voice rich and sonorous, "at the beginning of days made the gods the world and the seas and the dry land also. And cast they the stars across the night sky, and did set the sun and his wife the moon in the heavens to give light upon the world. And the gods caused the earth to bring forth the beasts, and the waters to bud with fish, and the skies to flower with birds. And they made men also, and divided men into peoples. Now the gods were 7 in number, and were all equal, and their names were Balar, and Shaldan, and Nedra, and Issa, and Mera, and Aldur, and Torak." Garion knew the story, of course. Everyone in that part of Sindaria was familiar with it. since the story was of Alorn origin, and the lands on 3 sides of Sandaria were Alorn kingdoms. Though the tale was familiar, however, he'd never heard it told in such a way. His mind soared, as in his imagination the gods themselves strode the world in those dim, misty days, when the world was first made, and a chill came over him at each mention of the forbidden name of Torak. He listened intently as the storyteller described how each god selected a people, for Balar the Alorns, for Issa the Nyasans, for Chaldan the Erins, for Nedra the Tolnadrans, for Mera the Merags, which are no more, and for Torak the Angaraks. And he heard how the god Aldur dwelt apart and considered the stars in his solitude, and how some very few men he accepted as pupils and disciples. Garion glanced at the others who were listening. Their faces were rapt with attention. Durnek's eyes were wide, and old Kralto's hands were clasped on the table in front of him. Faldor's face was pale, and tears stood in his eyes. Aunt Paul stood at the rear of the room. Though it wasn't cold, she too had drawn her mantle about her and stood very straight, her eyes intent. "And it came to pass," the storyteller continued, "that the god Aldur caused to be made a jewel in the shape of a globe, and behold, in the jewel was captured the light of certain stars that did glitter in the northern sky. And great was the enchantment upon the jewel which men called the orb of Aldur. For with the orb could Aldur see that which had been, and that which was, and that which was yet to be." Girion realized he was holding his breath, for he was now completely caught up in the story. He listened in wonder as Torak stole the orb, and the other gods made war upon him. Torak used the orb to sunder the earth and let in the sea to drown the land, until the orb struck back against misuse by melting the left side of his face and destroying his left hand and eye. The old man paused and drained his tankard. Aunt Paul, with her mantle still close about her, brought him another, her movements somehow stately and her eyes burning. "I've never heard the story told so," Durnek said softly. "It's the Book of Alorn. It's only told in the presence of kings," Kralto said, just as softly. "I knew a man once who heard it at a king's court in Sendar, and he remembered some of it. I've never heard it all before, though." There's a footnote here, by the way. Several shorter, less formal versions of the story existed, similar to the adaptation used here in the prologue. Even the Book of Alorn was said to be an abridgment of a much older document. The story continued, recounting how Belgarath the sorcerer led Sherrick and his 3 sons to regain the orb 2,000 years later, and how the western lands were settled and guarded against the hosts of Torak. The gods removed from the world, leaving Riva to safeguard the orb in his fortress on the Isle of the Winds. There he forged a great sword and set the orb in its hilt. While the orb remained there, and the line of Riva sat on the throne, Torak could not prevail. Then Belgarath sent his favourite daughter to Riva to be a mother to kings, while his other daughter remained with him, and learned his art, for the mark of the sorcerers was upon her. The old storyteller's voice was now very soft as his ancient tale drew to a close. "And between them," he said, "did Belgarath and his daughter, the sorceress Polgera, set enchantments to keep watch against the coming of Torak. And some men say they abide still against his coming, even though it be until the very end of days. For it is prophesied that one day shall maimed Torak come against the kingdoms of the west, to reclaim the orb with which he so dearly purchased, and battle shall be joined between Torak and the fruit of the line of Riva, and in that battle shall be decided the fate of the world." And then the old man fell silent, and let his mantle drop from about his shoulders, signifying that the story was at an end. There was a long silence in the hall, broken only by a few faint cracks from the dying fire, and the endless song of frogs and crickets in the summer night outside. Finally, Faldor cleared his throat and rose, his bench scraping loudly on the wooden floor. "You've done us much honor tonight, my old friend," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is an event we'll remember all our lives. You told us a kingly story, not usually wasted on ordinary people." The old man grinned then, his blue eyes twinkling. "I haven't consorted with many kings of late, Faldor," he laughed. "They all seem to be too busy to listen to the old tales, and a story must be told from time to time if it's not to be lost. Besides, who knows? These days, where a king might be hiding." They all laughed at that, and began to push back their benches, for it was growing late, and time for those who must be up with the first light of the sun to seek their beds. "Will you carry a lantern for me to the place where I sleep, boy?" the storyteller asked Garion. "Gladly," Garion said, jumping up and running into the kitchen. He fetched down a square glass lantern, lighted the candle inside it from one of the banked kitchen fires, and went back into the dining hall. Faldor was speaking with the storyteller. As he turned away, Garion saw a strange look pass between the old man and Aunt Paul, who stood at the back of the hall. Are we ready then, boy? The old man asked as Garion came up to him. Whenever you are, Garion replied, and the two of them turned and left the hall. Why is the story unfinished? Garion asked, bursting with curiosity. Why did you stop before we found out what happened when Torak met the Raven King? That's another story, the old man explained. Will you tell it to me sometime? Garion pressed. The old man laughed. Torak and the Raven King haven't as yet met, he said, so I can't very well tell it, can I? At least not until after their meeting. It's only a story, Garion objected. Isn't it? Is it? The old man removed a flagon of wine from under his tunic and took a long drink. Who's to say what's only a story and what's truth disguised as a story? It's only a story, Garion said stubbornly, suddenly feeling very hard-headed and practical like any good Sendar. It can't really be true, but Belgarath the Sorcerer would be I don't know how old, and people don't live that long. 7,000 years, the old man said. What? Belgarath the Sorcerer is 7,000 years old, perhaps a bit older. That's impossible, Garion said. Is it? How old are you? 9, next Aristide. And in 9 years you've learned everything that's both possible and impossible? You're a remarkable boy, Garion. Garion flushed. Well, he said, somehow now not quite sure of himself. The oldest man I ever heard of is old Weldrick over on Mildren's farm. Durnick says he's over 90, and that's the oldest man in the district. And it's a very big district, of course, the old man said solemnly. How old are you? Garion asked, not wanting to give up. Old enough, boy, the old man insisted. It's still only a story, Garion insisted. Many good and solid men would say so, the old man told him, looking up at the stars. Good men who will live out their lives believing only in what they can see and touch. But there's a world beyond what we can see and touch, and that world lives by its own laws. What may be impossible in this very ordinary world is very possible there, and sometimes the boundaries between the two worlds disappear, and then who can say what's possible and impossible? I think I'd rather live in the ordinary world, Garion said. The other one sounds too complicated. We don't always have that choice, Garion, the storyteller told him. Don't be too surprised if that other world someday chooses you to do something that must be done. Some great and noble thing. Me? Garion said incredulously. Stranger things have happened. Go to bed, boy. I think I'll look at the stars for a while. The stars and I are very old friends. The stars? Garion asked, looking up involuntarily. You're a very strange old man, if you don't mind my saying so. Indeed, the storyteller agreed. Quite the strangest you'll likely meet. I like you all the same, Garion said quickly, not wanting to give offense. That's a comfort, boy, the old man said. Now go to bed. Your Aunt Paul will be worried about you. Later, as he slept, Garion's dreams were troubled. The dark figure of maimed Torak loomed in the shadows, and monstrous things pursued him across twisted landscapes, where the possible and the impossible merged and joined as that other world reached out to claim him. That is Chapter 2. We'll quickly check for comments. Amanda has a question. What does the book smell like? Oh, the book smells like memories. This is a pretty old book. This is probably 30 years old. Maybe longer. Maybe longer that I've had this. I'm not exactly sure, but it smells good. I found that library books have a certain smell, but books that you own yourself and haven't really touched any other hands than yours, but are still well used and well read and long lived, have a very particular smell about them. And it's a really good smell. Like, I know the convenience of ebooks and having e-readers. You can have a lot of books stored in a very small space, but I will always love the feel and the smell of holding a real book in my hands. So, there's your answer as best I can give. All right, onward to Chapter 3. We've been going for about an hour now, but I've still got plenty of voice left in me, I think. Chapter 3. Some few mornings later, when Aunt Paul had begun to scowl at his continued lurking in her kitchen, the old man made excuse of some errand to the nearby village of Upper Gralt. "Good," Aunt Paul said, somewhat ungraciously. "At least my pantries will be safe while you're gone." He bowed mockingly, his eyes twinkling. "Do you need anything, Mistress Paul?" he asked. "Some trifling thing I might purchase for you, as long as I'm going anyway." Aunt Paul thought a moment. "Some of my spice pots are a bit low," she said, "and there's a Tollinger spice merchant in Fennel Lane, just south of the town tavern. I'm sure you'll have no trouble finding the tavern." "The trip is likely to be dry," the old man admitted pleasantly. "And lonely, too. 10 leagues with no one to talk to is a long way." "Talk to the birds," Aunt Paul suggested bluntly. "Birds listen well enough," the old man said, "but their speech is repetitious and quickly grows tiresome. Why don't I take the boy along for company?" Garion held his breath. "He's picking up enough bad habits on his own," Aunt Paul said tartly. "I prefer his not having expert instruction." "Why, Mistress Paul," the old man objected, stealing a crawler almost absently, "you do me an injustice. Besides, a change will do the boy good. Broaden his horizons, you might say." "His horizons are quite broad enough, thank you," she said. Garion's heart sank. "Still," she continued, "at least I can count on him not to forget my spices altogether, or to become so fuddled with ale that he confuses peppercorns with cloves or cinnamon with nutmeg. Very well, take the boy along, but mind, I don't want you taking him into any low or disreputable places." "Mistress Paul," the old man said, feigning shock, "would I frequent such places?" "I know you too well, old wolf," she said dryly. "You take to vice and corruption as naturally as a duck takes to a pond. If I hear you've taken the boy into any unsavory places, you and I will have words." "Then I'll have to make sure you don't hear of anything like that, won't I?" Aunt Paul gave him a hard look. "I'll see which spices I need," she said. "And I'll borrow a horse and cart from Faldor," the old man said, stealing another cruller. In a surprisingly short time, Garion and the old man were bouncing along the rutted road to Upper Gralt behind a fast-trotting horse. It was a bright summer morning, and there were a few dandelion-puffed clouds in the sky, and deep blue shadows under the hedgerows. After a few hours, however, the sun became hot, and the jolting ride became tiresome. "Are we almost there?" Garion asked for the third time. "Not for some time yet," the old man said. 10 leagues is a goodly distance." "I was there once before," Garion told him, trying to sound casual. "Of course, I was only a child at the time, so I don't remember too much about it. It seemed to be quite a fine place." The old man shrugged. "It's a village," he said, "much like any other." He seemed a bit preoccupied. Garion, hoping to nudge the old man into a story to make the miles go faster, began asking questions. "Why is it you have no name, if I'm not being impolite in asking?" "I have many names," the old man said, scratching his white beard. "Almost as many names as I have years." "I've only got one," Garion said. "So far." "What?" "You only have one name so far," the old man explained. "In time you may get another, or even several. Some people collect names as they go along through their lives. Sometimes names wear out, just like clothes." "Aunt Paul calls you Old Wolf," Garion said. "I know," the old man said. "Your Aunt Paul and I have known each other for a very long time." "Why does she call you that?" "Who can say why a woman such as your aunt does anything?" "May I call you Mr. Wolf?" Garion asked. Names were quite important to Garion, and the fact the old storyteller didn't seem to have one always bothered him. That namelessness had made the old man seem somehow incomplete, unfinished. The old man looked at him soberly for a moment, and then he burst out laughing. "Mr. Wolf, indeed. How very appropriate. I think I like that name better than any I've had in years." "May I, then?" Garion asked. "Call you Mr. Wolf, I mean." "I think I'd like that, Garion. I think I'd like that very much." "Now would you please tell me a story, Mr. Wolf?" Garion asked. The time and distance went by much faster then, as Mr. Wolf wove for Garion tales of glorious adventure and dark treachery taken from those gloomy, unending centuries of horrendous civil wars. "Why are the errands like that?" Garion asked after a particularly grim tale. "The errands are very noble," Wolf said, lounging back in the seat of the cart with reins held negligently in one hand. "Nobility is a trade that's not always trustworthy, since it sometimes causes men to do things for obscure reasons." "Brunderig's an errand," Garion said. "He sometimes seems to be, well, not too quick of thought, if you know what I mean." "It's the effect of all that nobility," Wolf said. "Errands spend so much time concentrating on being noble, they don't have time to think of other things." They came over the crest of a long hill, and there in the next valley lay the village of Upper Gralt. Ooh, hang on a sec. Something just happened on my screen. Okay, it was just a little flicker there. I think we're still going. They came over the crest of a long hill, and there in the next valley lay the village of Upper Gralt. To Gary, the tiny cluster of grey stone houses with slate roofs seemed disappointingly small. 2 roads, white with thick dust, intersected there, and there were a few narrow, winding streets besides. The houses were square and solid, but seemed almost like toys set down in the valley below. The horizon beyond was ragged with the mountains of eastern Sandaria, and though it was summer, the tops of most of the mountains were still wrapped in snow. Their tired horse plodded down the hill toward the village, his hooves stirring little clouds of dust with each step, and soon they were clattering along the cobblestone streets toward the center of the village. The villagers, of course, were all too important to pay any attention to an old man and a small boy in a farm cart. The women wore gowns and high-pointed hats, and the men wore doublets and soft velvet caps. Their expressions seemed haughty, and they looked with obvious disdain at the few farmers in town who respectfully stood aside to let them pass. "They're very fine, aren't they?" Garion observed. "They seem to think so," Wolf said, his expression faintly amused. "I think it's time we found something to eat, don't you?" Though he had not realized it until the old man mentioned it, Garion was suddenly ravenous. "Where will we go?" he asked. "They all seem so splendid. Would any of them let strangers sit at their tables?" Wolf laughed and shook a jingling purse at his waist. "We should have no trouble making acquaintances," he said. "There are places where one may buy food." Buy food? Garion had never heard of such a thing before. Anyone who appeared at Faldor's gate at mealtime was invited to the table as a matter of course. The world of the villagers was obviously very different from the world of Faldor's farm. "But I don't have any money," he objected. "I have enough for us both," Wolf assured him, stopping their horse before a large low building with a sign bearing a picture of a cluster of grapes hanging just above its door. There were words on the sign, but of course Garion couldn't read them. What do the words say, Mr. Wolf?" he asked. "They say that food and drink may be bought inside," Wolf told him, getting down from the cart. "It must be a fine thing to be able to read," Garion said wistfully. The old man looked at him, seeming surprised. "You can't read, boy?" he asked incredulously. "Never found anyone to teach me," Garion said. "Faldor reads, I think, but no one else at the farm knows how." "Nonsense," Wolf snorted. "I'll speak to your aunt about it. She's been neglecting her responsibility. She should have taught you years ago." "Can Aunt Paul read?" Garion asked, stunned. "Of course she can," Wolf said, leading the way into the tavern. "She says she finds little advantage in it, but she and I have had that particular argument out many years ago." The old man seemed quite upset by Garion's lack of education. Garion, however, was far too interested in the smoky interior of the tavern to pay much attention. The room was large and dark, with a low-beamed ceiling and stone floor strewn with rushes. Though it wasn't cold, a fire burned in a stone pit in the center of the room, and the smoke rose errantly toward a chimney set above it on 4 square stone pillars. Tallow candles guttered in clay dishes on several of the long, stained tables, and there was a reek of wine and stale beer in the air. "What have you to eat?" Wolf demanded of a sour, unshaven man wearing a grease-spotted apron. "We have a bit of a joint left," the man said, pointing at a spit resting to one side of the fire pit. "Roasted only day before yesterday, and meat porridge fresh yesterday morning, and bread no more than a week old." "Very well, then," Wolf said, sitting down. "And I'll have a pot of your best ale and milk for the boy." "Milk?" Garion protested. "Milk," Wolf said firmly. "You have money?" the sour-looking man demanded. Wolf jingled his purse, and the sour man looked suddenly less sour. "Why's that man over there sleeping?" Garion asked, pointing at a snoring villager, sitting with his head down on one of the tables. "Drunk," Wolf said, scarcely glancing at the snoring man. "Shouldn't someone take care of him?" "He'd rather not be taken care of." "Do you know him?" "I know of him," Wolf said, "and many others like him. I've occasionally been in that condition myself." "Why?" "It seemed appropriate at the time." The roast was dry and overdone, the meat porridge was thin and watery, and the bread was stale, but Garion was too hungry to notice. He carefully cleaned his plate as he'd been taught, then sat as Mr. Wolf lingered over a second pot of ale. "Quite splendid," he said, more to be saying something than out of any real conviction. All in all, he found that Upper Gralt didn't live up to his expectations. "Adequate," Wolf shrugged. "Village taverns are much the same the world over. I've seldom seen one I'd hurry to revisit. Shall we go?" He laid down a few coins, which the sour-looking man snatched up quickly, and led Garion back out into the afternoon sunlight. "Let's find your aunt's spice merchant," he said, "and then see to a night's lodging, and a stable for our horse." They set off down the street, leaving horse and cart beside the tavern. The house of the Tonnerden spice merchant was a tall, narrow building in the next street. Two swarthy, thick-bodied men in short tunics lounged in the street at the front door, near a fierce-looking black horse wearing a curious armoured saddle. The two men stared with dull-eyed disinterest at passers-by in the lane. Mr. Wolf stopped when he caught sight of them. "Is something wrong?" Garion asked. "Thulls," Wolf said quietly, looking at the two men. "What?" "Those two are Thulls," the old man said. "They usually work as porters for the Murgos." "What are Murgos?" "The people of Cathal Murgos," Wolf said shortly. "Southern Angaraks." "The ones we beat at the Battle of Omember?" Garion asked. "Why would they be here?" "The Murgos have taken up commerce," Wolf said, frowning. "I hadn't expected to see one of them in so remote a village. We may as well go in. The Thulls have seen us, and it might look strange if we turned now and went back. Stay close to me, boy, and don't say anything." They walked past the two heavy-set men and entered the spice merchant's shop. The Tolnerdrum was a thin, bald-headed man wearing a brown, belted gown that reached to the floor. He was nervously weighing several packets of pungent-smelling powder, which lay on the counter before him. "Good day to you," he said to Wolf. "Please have patience. I'll be with you shortly." He spoke with a slight lisp that Garion found peculiar. "No hurry," Wolf said in a wheezing, cracking voice. Garion looked at him sharply and was astonished to see that his friend had stooped and that his head was nodding foolishly. "See to their needs," the other man in the shop said shortly. He was a dark, burly man wearing a chainmail shirt and a short sword belted to his waist. His cheekbones were high, and there were several savage-looking scars on his face. His eyes looked curiously angular, and his voice was harsh and thickly accented. "No hurry," Wolf said in his wheezy cackle. "My business here will take some time," the Murgo said coldly, "and I prefer not to be rushed. Tell the merchant here what you need, old man." "My thanks, then," Wolf cackled. "I have a list somewhere about me." He began to fumble foolishly in his pockets. "My master drew it up. I hope you can read it, friend merchant, for I cannot." He finally found the list and presented it to the Tolnerdrum. The merchant glanced at the list. "This will only take a moment," he told the Murgo. The Murgo nodded and stood staring stonily at Wolf and Garion. His eyes narrowed slightly, and his expression changed. "You're a seemly-appearing boy," he said to Garion. "What's your name?" Until that moment in his entire life, Garion had been an honest and truthful boy. But Wolf's manner had opened before his eyes an entire world of deception and subterfuge. Somewhere in the back of his mind he seemed to hear a warning voice, a dry, calm voice advising him that the situation was dangerous and he should take steps to protect himself. He hesitated only an instant before telling his first deliberate lie. He allowed his mouth to drop open and his face to assume an expression of vacant-headed stupidity. "Runderig, your honour," he mumbled. "An Erendish name," the Murgo said, his eyes narrowing even more. "You don't look like an errand." Garion gaped at him. "Are you an errand, Runderig?" The Murgo pressed. Garion frowned as if struggling with the thought while his mind raced. The dry voice suggested several alternatives. "My father was," he said finally, "but my mother's a centaur and people say I favour her." "You say was," the Murgo said quickly. "Is your father dead then?" His scarred face was intent. Garion nodded foolishly. "A tree he was cutting fell on him," he lied. "It was a long time ago." The Murgo suddenly seemed to lose interest. "Here's a copper penny for you, boy," he said, indifferently tossing a small coin on the floor at Garion's feet. "It has the likeness of the god Torak stamped upon it. Perhaps it will bring you luck, or at least more wit." Wolf stooped quickly and retrieved the coin, but the coin he handed to Garion was a common Sendarian penny. "Thank the good man, Runderig," he wheezed. "My thanks, your honour," Garion said, concealing the penny tightly in his fist. The Murgo shrugged and looked away. Wolf paid the Tolnerdrum merchant for the spices, and he and Garion left the shop. "You played a dangerous game, boy," Wolf said once they were out of earshot of the two lounging Thulls. "You seem not to want him to know who we are," Garion explained. "I wasn't sure why, but I thought I ought to do the same. Was what I did wrong?" "You're very quick," Wolf said approvingly. "I think we managed to deceive the Murgo." "Why did you change the coin?" Garion asked. "Sometimes Angarat coins are not what they seem," Wolf said. "It's better for you not to have any of them. Let's fetch our horse and cart. It's a long way back to Fowler's farm." "I thought we were going to take lodging for the night." "That's changed now. Come along, boy. It's time for us to leave." The horse was very tired, and he moved slowly up the long hill out of Upper Grault as the sun went down ahead of them. "Why wouldn't you let me keep the Angarak penny, Mr. Wolf?" Garion persisted. The subject still puzzled him. "There are many things in this world that seem to be one thing and are in fact another," Wolf said somewhat grimly. "I don't trust Angaraks, and I particularly don't trust Murgos. It would be just as well, I think, if you never had in your possession anything that bears the likeness of Torak." But the war between the West and the Angrics has been over for 500 years now, Garion objected. All men say so. Not all men, Wolf said. Now take that robe out of the back of the cart and cover up. Your aunt would never forgive me if you should take a chill. I will if you think I should, Garion said, but I'm not a bit cold and not at all sleepy. I'll keep you company as we go. That'll be a comfort, boy, Wolf said. Mr. Wolf, Garion said after some time, did you know my mother and father? Yes, Wolf said quietly. My father's dead too, isn't he? I'm afraid so. Garion sighed deeply. I thought so, he said. I wish I'd known them. Aunt Paul says I was only a baby when... He couldn't bring himself to say it. I tried to remember my mother, but I can't. You were very small, Wolf said. What were they like? Garion asked. Wolf scratched at his beard. Ordinary, he said. So ordinary you wouldn't look twice at either of them. Garion was offended by that. Aunt Paul says my mother was very beautiful, he objected. She was. Then how can you say she was ordinary? She wasn't prominent or important, Wolf said. Neither was your father. Anyone who saw them thought that they were just simple village people, a young man with a young wife and their baby. That's all anyone ever saw. That's all anyone was ever supposed to see. I don't understand. It's very complicated. What was my father like? Medium size, Wolf said. Dark hair. Very serious young man. I liked him. Did he love my mother? More than anything. And me? Of course. What kind of place did they live in? It was a small place, Wolf said. A little village near the mountains, a long way from many main roads. They had a cottage at the end of the street. It was a small, solid little house. Your father built it himself. He was a stonecutter. He used to stop by there once in a while when I was in the neighborhood. The old man's voice droned on, describing the village and the house and the two who lived there. Garion listened, not even realizing it when he fell asleep. It must have been very late, almost on toward dawn. In a half-drowse, the boy felt himself lifted from the cart and carried up a flight of stairs. The old man was surprisingly strong. Aunt Paul was there. He knew that without even opening his eyes. There was a particular scent about her that he could have found even in a dark room. Just cover him up, Mr. Wolf said softly to Aunt Paul. Best not to wake him just now. What happened? Aunt Paul said, her voice as soft as the old man's. There was a Murgo in town, at your spice merchant's. He asked questions and he tried to give the boy an Angrak penny. In Upper Gralt, are you certain he was only a Murgo? It's impossible to tell. Not even I can distinguish between Murgo and Grolum with any certainty. What happened to the coin? I was quick enough to get it. I gave the boy a Sendarian penny instead. If our Murgo was a Grolum, we'll let him follow me. I'm sure I can give him several months of entertainment. You'll be leaving them? Aunt Paul's voice seemed somehow sad. It's time, Wolf said. Right now the boy is safe enough here, and I must go abroad. There are things afoot I must see to. When Murgos begin to appear in remote places, I begin to worry. We have a great responsibility and a great care placed upon us, and we mustn't allow ourselves to become careless. Will you be gone long? Aunt Paul asked. Some years, I expect. There are many things I have to look into, and people I have to see. I'll miss you, Aunt Paul said softly. He laughed. Sentimentality, Paul? He said dryly. That's hardly in character. You know what I mean. I'm not suited to this task you and the others have given me. What do I know about the raising of small boys? You're doing well, Wolf said. Keep the boy close and don't let his nature drive you into hysterics. Be careful. He lies like a champion. Garion? Her voice was shocked. He lied to the Murgos so well that even I was impressed. Garion. He's also started asking questions about his parents, Wolf said. How much have you told him? Very little, only that they're dead. Let's leave it at that for now. There's no point in telling him things he isn't old enough to cope with yet. Their voices went on, but Garion drifted off into sleep again, and he was almost sure that it was still a dream. But the next morning when he awoke, Mr. Wolf was gone. This ends Chapter 3. Not seeing any new comments there, so we're going to push right on ahead to Chapter 4. Chapter 4. The seasons turned, as seasons will. Summer ripened into autumn, the blaze of autumn died into winter. Winter grudgingly relented to the urgency of spring, and the spring bloomed into summer again. With the turning of the seasons, the years turned, and Garion imperceptibly grew older. As he grew, the other children grew as well, all except poor Darun, who seemed doomed to be short and skinny all his life. Runderig exploded like a young tree and was soon almost as big as any man on the farm. Soubrette, of course, didn't grow so tall, but she developed in other ways which the boys began to find interesting. In the early autumn, just before Garion's 14th birthday, he came very close to ending his career. In response to some primal urge all children have, given a pond and a handy supply of logs, they'd built a raft that summer. The raft was neither very large, nor was it particularly well built. It had a tendency to sink on one end if the weight aboard it were improperly distributed, and an alarming habit of coming apart at unexpected moments. Quite naturally, it was Garion who was aboard the raft, showing off, on that fine autumn day when the raft quite suddenly decided once and for all to revert to its original state. The bindings all came undone and the logs began to go their separate ways. Realizing his danger only at the last moment, Garion made a desperate effort to pull for shore, but his haste only made the disintegration of the craft more rapid. In the end, he found himself standing on a single log, his arms windmilling wildly in a futile effort to retain his balance. His eyes, desperately searching for some aid, swept the marshy shore. Some distance up the slope behind his playmates, he saw the familiar figure of the man on the black horse. The man wore a dark robe, and his burning eyes watched the boy's plight. Then the spiteful log rolled under Garion's feet, and he toppled and fell with a resounding splash. Garion's education, unfortunately, hadn't included instruction in the art of swimming, and while the water was not really very deep, it was deep enough. The bottom of the pond was very unpleasant, a kind of dark weedy ooze inhabited by frogs, turtles, and a singularly unsavory-looking eel that slithered away snake-like when Garion plunged like a sinking rock into the weeds. Garion struggled, gulped water, and launched himself with his legs toward the surface again. Like a broaching whale, he rose from the depths, gasped a couple of quick, sputtering breaths, and heard the screams of his playmates. The dark figure on the slope hadn't moved, and for a single instant, every detail of that bright afternoon was etched on Garion's mind. He even observed that, although the rider was open under the full glare of the autumn sun, neither man nor horse cast any shadow. Even as his mind grappled with that impossibility, he sank once more to the murky bottom. It occurred to him as he struggled, drowning, almost among the weeds, that if he could launch himself up in the vicinity of the log, he might catch hold of it and so remain afloat. He waved off a startled-looking frog and plunged upward again. He came up, unfortunately, directly under the log. The blow on the top of his head filled his eyes with light and his ears with a roaring sound, and he sank, no longer struggling, back toward the weeds which seemed to reach up for him. And then Dernick was there. Garion found himself lifted roughly by the hair toward the surface, and then towed by that same convenient handle toward the shore behind Dernick's powerfully turning strokes. The smith pulled the semi-conscious boy out onto the bank, turned him over, and stepped on him several times to force the water out of his lungs. Garion's ribs creaked. "Enough, Dernick," he gasped finally. He sat up, and the blood from the splendid cut on the top of his head immediately ran into his eyes. He wiped the blood clear and looked around for the dark, shadowless rider, but the figure had vanished. He tried to get up, but the world suddenly spun around him, and he fainted. When he awoke, he was in his own bed with his head wrapped in bandages. Aunt Paul stood beside the bed, her eyes blazing. "You stupid boy," she cried. "What were you doing in that pond?" "Rafting," Garion said, trying to make it sound quite ordinary. "Rafting?" she said. "Rafting? Who gave you permission?" "Well," he said uncertainly, You just what?" He looked at her helplessly. And then with a low cry she took him in her arms and crushed him to her almost suffocatingly. Briefly Garion considered telling her about the strange shadowless figure that had watched his struggles in the pond, but the dry voice in his mind that sometimes spoke to him told him that this wasn't the time for that. He seemed to know somehow that the business between him and the man on the black horse was something very private, and that the time would inevitably come when they would face each other in some kind of contest of will or deed. To speak of it now to Aunt Paul would involve her in the matter, and he didn't want that. He wasn't sure exactly why, but he did know that the dark figure was an enemy, and though that thought was a bit frightening, it was also exciting. There was no question that Aunt Paul could deal with a stranger, but if she did, Garion knew that he would lose something very personal, and for some reason very important, and so he said nothing. "It wasn't really anything all that dangerous, Aunt Paul," he said instead, rather lamely. "I was starting to get the idea of how to swim. I'd have been all right if I hadn't hit my head on that log." "But of course you did hit your head," she pointed out. "Well, yes, but it wasn't that serious. I'd have been all right in a minute or two." "Under the circumstances, I'm not sure you had a minute or two," she said bluntly. "Well," he faltered, and then decided to let it drop. That marked the end of Garion's freedom. Aunt Paul confined him to the scullery. He grew to know every dent and scratch on every pot in the kitchen intimately. He once estimated gloomily that he washed each one 21 times a week. In a seeming orgy of messiness, Aunt Paul suddenly couldn't even boil water without dirtying at least 3 or 4 pans. And Garion had to scrub every one. He hated it, and began to think quite seriously of running away. As autumn progressed and the winter began to deteriorate, the other children were more or less confined to the compound as well, and it wasn't so bad. Runderig, of course, was seldom with them anymore, since his man's size had made him, even more than Garion, subject to more and more frequent labor. When he could, Garion slipped away to be with Soubrette and Dorum, but they no longer found much entertainment in leaping into the hay, or in the endless games of tag in the stables and barns. They'd reached an age and size where adults rather quickly noticed such idleness and found tasks to occupy them. Most often they would sit in some out-of-the-way place and simply talk, which is to say that Garion and Soubrette would sit and listen to the endless flow of Dorun's chatter. That small, quick boy was unable to be quiet, as he was to sit still, could seemingly talk for hours about a half-dozen raindrops, and his words tumbled out breathlessly as he fidgeted. "What's that mark on your hand, Garion?" Soubrette asked one rainy day, interrupting Dorun's bubbling voice. Garion looked at the perfectly round white patch on the palm of his right hand. "I've noticed it too," Dorun said, quickly changing subjects in mid-sentence. "But Garion grew up in the kitchen, didn't you, Garion? It's probably a place where he burned himself when he was little. Reached out before anyone could stop him. Put his hand on something hot. I bet his Aunt Paul got really angry about that, because she can get angrier faster than anyone else I've ever seen. And she can really—" "It's always been there," Garion said, tracing the mark on his palm with his left forefinger. He'd never really looked at it carefully before. It covered the entire palm of his hand and had, in a certain light, had a faint silvery sheen. "Maybe it's a birthmark," Soubrette suggested. "I bet that's it," Dorun said quickly. "I saw a man once that had a big purple one on the side of his face, one of those wagoners who comes by to pick up the turnip crops in the fall. Anyway, the mark was all over the side of his face, and I thought it was a big bruise at first, and thought it must have been in an awful fight. Those wagoners fight all the time, but then I saw it wasn't really a bruise, like Brett said. It was a birthmark. I wonder what causes things like that." That evening, after he'd gotten ready for bed, he asked his Aunt Paul about it. "What's this mark, Aunt Paul?" he asked, holding his hand up, palm out. She looked up from where she was brushing her long, dark hair. "It's nothing to worry about," she told him. "I wasn't worried about it," he said. "I just wondered what it was. Soubrette and Dorun think it's a birthmark. Is that what it is?" "Something like that," she said. "Did either of my parents have the same kind of mark?" "Your father did. It's been in the family for a long time." A sudden strange thought occurred to Garion. Without knowing why, he reached out the hand and touched the white lock at his aunt's brow. "Is it like that white place in your hair?" she asked. He felt a sudden tingle in his hand, and it seemed somehow that a window opened in his mind. At first there was only the sense of uncountable years, moving past like a vast sea of ponderously rolling clouds, and then, sharper than any knife, a feeling of endless repeated loss, of sorrow. Then, more recent, there was his own face, and behind it more faces, old, young, regal or quite ordinary, and behind them all, no longer foolish as it sometimes seemed, the face of Mr. Wolfe. But more than anything, there was a knowledge of an unearthly, inhuman power, the certainty of an unconquerable will. Aunt Paul moved her head away almost absently. "Don't do that, Garion," she said, and the window in his mind shut. "What was it?" he asked, burning with curiosity and wanting to open the window again. "A simple trick," she said. "Show me how?" "Not yet, my Garion," she said, taking his face between her hands. "Not yet. You're not ready yet. Now go to bed." "You'll be here?" he asked, a little frightened now. "I'll always be here," she said, tucking him in. And then she went back to brushing her long, thick hair, humming a strange song as she did in a deep, melodious voice. To that sound he fell asleep. After that, not even Garion himself saw the mark on his own palm very often. There suddenly seemed to be all kinds of dirty jobs for him to do, which kept not only his hands, but the rest of him as well, very dirty. The most important holiday in Cinderia, and indeed in the rest of the kingdoms of the West, was Aristide. It commemorated that day eons before, when the 7 gods joined hands to create the world with a single word. The festival of Aristide took place in midwinter, and because there was little to do on a farm like Fowler's in that season, it had by custom become a splendid 2-week celebration, with feasts and gifts, and decorations in the dining hall, and little pageants honouring the gods. These last, of course, were a reflection of Faldor's piety. Faldor, though he was a good, simple man, had no illusions about how widely his sentiments were shared by others on the farm. He thought, however, that some outward show of devotional activity was in keeping with the season, and because he was such a good master, the people on his farm chose to humor him. It was also at the season, unfortunately, that Faldor's married daughter, Enhelda, and her husband, Aelbrig, made their customary annual visit to remain on speaking terms with their father. Enhelda had no intention of endangering her inheritance rights by seeming inattention. Her visits, however, were a trial to Faldor, who looked upon his daughter's somewhat overdressed and supercilious husband, a minor functionary in a commercial house in the capital city of Sendar, with scarcely concealed contempt. Their arrival, however, marked the beginning of the Aristide festival at Faldor's farm, so while no one cared for them personally, their appearance was always greeted with a certain enthusiasm. The weather that year had been particularly foul, even for Sendaria. The rains had settled in early, and were soon followed by a period of soggy snow. Not the crisp, bright powder which came later in the winter, but a damp slush, always half melting. For Garion, those duties in the kitchen now prevented him from joining with his former playmates in their traditional pre-holiday orgy of anticipatory excitement. The approaching holiday seemed somehow flat and stale. He yearned back to the good old days and often sighed with regret and moped about the kitchen, like a sandy-haired cloud of doom. Even the traditional decorations in the dining hall, where Aristide festivities always took place, seemed decidedly tacky to him that year. The fir boughs festooning the ceiling beams were somehow not as green, and the polished apples carefully tied to the boughs were smaller and not as red. He sighed some more and reveled in his sullen moping. Aunt Paul, however, was not impressed, and her attitude was firmly unsympathetic. She routinely checked his brow with her hand for signs of fever, and then dosed him with the foulest-tasting tonic she could concoct. Garion was careful after that to mope in private and to sigh less audibly. That dry, secret part of his mind informed him matter-of-factly that he was being ridiculous, but Garion chose not to listen. The voice in his mind was much older and wiser than he, but it seemed determined to take all the fun out of life. On the morning of Aristide, a Murgo and 5 thulls appeared with a wagon outside the gate, and asked to see Faldor. Garion, who had long since learned that no one pays attention to a boy, and that many interesting things may be learned by placing himself in a position to casually overhear conversations, busied himself with some small, unimportant chore near the gate. The Murgo, his face scarred much like the face of the one in Upper Grault, sat importantly on the wagon seat, his chain-mail shirt clinking each time he moved. He wore a black hooded robe, and his sword was much in evidence. His eyes moved constantly, taking in everything. The thulls in muddy felt boots and heavy cloaks lounged disinterestedly against the wagon, seemingly indifferent to the raw wind whipping across the snowy fields. Faldor, in his finest doublet, it was after all Aristide, came across the yard, closely followed by Enhelda and Aelbrig. "Good morning, friend," Faldor said to the Murgo. "Joyous Aristide to you." The Murgo grunted. "You are, I take it, the farmer Faldor?" he asked, in his heavily accented voice. "I am," Faldor replied. "I understand you have a goodly number of hams on hand, well cured." "The pigs did well this year," Faldor answered modestly. "I will buy them," the Murgo announced, jingling his purse. Faldor bowed. "First thing tomorrow morning," he said. The Murgo stared. "This is a pious household," Faldor explained. "We do not offend the gods by breaking the sanctity of Aristide." "Father," Enhelda snapped, "don't be foolish. This noble merchant has come a long way to do business." "Not on Aristide," Faldor said stubbornly, his long face firm. "In the city of Sendar," Aelbrig said in his rather high-pitched nasal voice, "we do not let such sentimentality interfere with business." "This is not the city of Sendar," Faldor said flatly. "This is Faldor's farm, and on Faldor's farm we do no work and conduct no business on Aristide." "Father," Enhelda protested, "the noble merchant has gold. Gold, father, gold!" "I'll hear no more of it," Faldor announced. He turned to the Murgo. "You and your servants are welcome to join us in our celebration, friend," he said. "We can provide quarters for you and the promise of the finest dinner in all Sendaria, and the opportunity to honor the gods on the special day. No man is made poorer by attending to his religious obligations." "We do not observe this holiday in Cthulmurgos," the scarred man said coldly. "As the noble lady says, I've come a long way to do business. I've not much time to tarry. I'm sure there are other farmers in the district with the merchandise I require." "Father," Enhelda wailed. "I know my neighbours," Faldor said quietly. "Your luck today will be small, I fear. The observance of the day is a firm tradition in this area." The Murgo thought for a moment. "It may be as you say," he said finally. "I'll accept your invitation, provided we can do business as early as possible tomorrow." Faldor bowed. I'll place myself at your service at first light tomorrow if you so desire. Done then, the Murgo said, climbing down from his wagon. That afternoon the feast was laid in the dining hall. The kitchen helpers and a half-dozen others who'd been pressed into service for the special day scurried from kitchen to hall, bearing smoking roasts, steaming hams, and sizzling geese, all under the lash of Aunt Paul's tongue. Garion observed sourly as he struggled with an enormous baron of beef that Faldor's prohibition of work on Aristide stopped at the kitchen door. In time, all was ready. The tables were loaded, the fires in the fireplace burned brightly. Dozens of candles filled the hall with golden light. The torches flared in their rings in the stone pillars. Faldor's people, in all their best clothes, filed into the hall, their mouths watering in anticipation. When all were seated, Faldor rose from his bench at the head of the center table. "Dear friends," he said, lifting his tankard, "I dedicate this feast to the gods." "The gods," the people responded in unison, rising respectfully. Faldor drank briefly, and they all followed suit. "Hear me, O gods," he prayed. "Most humbly we thank you for the bounty of this fair world that you made on this day, and we dedicate ourselves to your service for yet another year." He looked for a moment as if he were going to say more, but then sat down instead. Faldor always labored for many hours over special prayers for occasions such as this, but the agony of speaking in public invariably caused his words so carefully prepared, erased the words so carefully prepared from his mind. His prayers, therefore, were always very sincere and very short. "Eat, dear friends," he instructed. "Do not let the food grow cold." And so they ate, and Helda and Aelbrig, who joined them all at this one meal only at Faldor's insistence, devoted their conversational efforts to the Murgo, since he was the only one in the room who was worthy of their attention. "I've long thought of visiting Thalmurgos," Aelbrig stated rather pompously. "Don't you agree, friend merchant, that greater contact between East and West is the way to overcome these mutual suspicions that have so marred our relationship in the past?" "We Murgos prefer to keep to ourselves," the scar-faced man said shortly. "But you're here, friend," Aelbrig pointed out. "Doesn't that suggest that greater contact might prove beneficial?" "I'm here as a duty," the Murgo said. "I don't visit here out of preference." He looked around the room. Are these then all your people?" he asked Faldor. "Every soul is here," Faldor told him. "I was led to believe that there was an old man here, with white hair and beard." "Not here, friend," Faldor said. "I myself am the eldest here, and as you can see, my hair is far from white." "One of my countrymen met such a one some years ago," the Murgo said. "He was accompanied by an Arendish boy. Runderig, I believe his name was." Garion, seated at the next table, kept his face to his plate, and listened so hard he thought his ears must be glowing. "We have a boy named Runderig here," Faldor said. "That tall lad at the end of the far table over there," he pointed. "No," the Murgo said, looking hard at Runderig. "That isn't the boy who was described to me." "It's not an uncommon name among Garans," Faldor said. "Quite probably your friend met a pair from another farm." "That must be it," the Murgo said, seeming to dismiss the affair. "This ham is excellent," he said, pointing at his plate, with the point of the dagger with which he ate. "Are the ones in your smokehouse of similar quality?" "Oh, no, friend merchant," Faldor laughed. "You won't so easily trick me into talking business on this day." The Murgo smiled briefly, the expression appearing strange on his scarred face. "One can always try," he said. "I would, however, compliment your cook." A compliment for you, Mistress Paul," Faldor said, raising his voice slightly. "A friend from Thalmurgos finds your cooking much to his liking." "I thank him for his compliment," Aunt Paul said somewhat coldly. The Murgo looked at her, and his eyes widened slightly as if in recognition. "A noble meal, great lady," he said, bowing slightly in her direction. "Your kitchen is a place of magic." "No," she said, her face suddenly very haughty. "Not magic. Cooking is an art which anyone with patience may learn. Magic is quite something else." "But magic is also an art, great lady," the Murgo said. "There are many who think so," Aunt Paul said, "but true magic comes from within and is not the result of nimble fingers which trick the eye." The Murgo stared at her, his face hard, and she returned his gaze with steely eyes. To Garion sitting nearby, it seemed as if something had passed between them that had nothing to do with the words they spoke. A kind of challenge seemed to hang in the air. And then the Murgo looked away almost as if he feared to take up that challenge. When the meal was over, it was time for the rather simple pageant which traditionally marked Aristide. 7 of the older farmhands who had slipped away earlier appeared in the doorway, wearing the long hooded robes and carefully carved and painted masks, which represented the faces of the gods. The costumes were old and showed the wrinkles which were the result of having been packed away in Faldor's attic for the past year. With a slow step, the robed and masked figures paced into the hall and lined up at the foot of the table where Faldor sat. Then each in turn spoke a short piece which identified the god he represented. "I am Aldur." Krauto's voice came from behind the first mask. "The god who dwells alone, and I command this world to be." "I am Balar," came another familiar voice from behind the second mask. "Bear god of the Alorns, and I command this world to be." And so it went down the line. Chaldan, Issa, Nedra, Mara, and then finally the last figure, which, unlike the others, was robed in black and whose mask was made of steel instead of painted wood. "I'm Torak," Durnek's voice came hollowly from behind his mask. "Dragon god of the Angarax, and I command this world to be." A movement caught Garion's eye, and he looked quickly. The Murgo had covered his face with both hands in a strange, almost ceremonial gesture. Behind him, at the far table, the 5 Thulls were ashen-faced and trembling. The 7 figures at the foot of Faldor's table joined their hands. "We are the gods," they said in unison, "and we command this world to be." "Hearken unto the words of the gods," Faldor proclaimed. "Welcome are the gods in the house of Faldor." "The blessing of the gods be upon the house of Faldor," the 7 replied, "and upon all this company." And then they turned, and as slowly as they'd come, they paced from the hall. And then came the gifts. There was much excitement at this, for the gifts were all from Faldor, and the good farmer struggled long each year to provide the most suitable gift for each of his people. New tunics and hose and gowns and shoes were much in evidence, but Garion this year was nearly overwhelmed when he opened a smallish cloth-wrapped bundle and found a neat, well-sheathed dagger. "He's nearly a man," Faldor explained to Aunt Paul, "and a man always has need of a good knife." Garion, of course, immediately tested the edge of his gift and quite promptly managed to cut his finger. "It was inevitable, I suppose," Aunt Paul said, but whether she was speaking of the cut or the gift itself, or the fact of Garion's growing up, was not entirely clear. The Murgo bought his hams the next morning, and he and the 5 Thulls departed. A few days later, Anhelda and Aelbrig packed up and left on the return journey to the city of Sendar, and Faldor's farm returned to normal. The winter plodded on. The snows came and went, and spring returned as it always does. The only thing which made the spring any different from any other was the arrival of Brill, the new hand. One of the younger farmers had married and rented a small nearby croft, and had left, laden down with practical gifts and good advice from Faldor to begin his new life as a married man. Brill was hired to replace him. Garion found Brill to be a definitely unattractive addition to the farm. The man's tunic and hose were patched and stained, his black hair and scraggly beard were unkempt, and one of his eyes looked off in a different direction than its fellows. He was a sour, solitary man, and he was none too clean. He seemed to carry with him an acrid reek of stale sweat that hung in his vicinity like a miasma. After a few attempts at conversation, Garion gave up and avoided him. The boy, however, had other things to occupy his mind with during that spring and summer. Though he had until then considered her to be more of an inconvenience than a genuine playmate, quite suddenly he began to notice Zubret. He had always known that she was pretty, but until that particular season that fact seemed unimportant, and he had much preferred the company of Runderik and Dorum. Now matters had changed. He noticed that the 2 other boys had also begun to pay more attention to her as well, and for the first time he began to feel the stirrings of jealousy. Zubret, of course, flirted outrageously with all 3 of them, and positively glowed when they glared at each other in her presence. Runderig's duties in the field kept him away most of the time, but Dorum was a serious worry to Garion. He became quite nervous and frequently found excuses to go about the compound to make certain that Durun and Zubret were not alone together. His own campaign was charmingly simple. He resorted to bribery. Zubret, like all little girls, was fond of sweets, and Garion had access to the entire kitchen. In a short period of time they'd worked out an arrangement. Garion would steal sweets from the kitchen for his sunny-haired playmate, and in return she would let him kiss her. Things might have perhaps gone further if Aunt Paul had not caught them in the midst of such an exchange one bright summer afternoon in the seclusion of the hay barn. "That's quite enough of that," she announced firmly from the doorway. Garion jumped guiltily away from Zubret. "I've got something in my eye," Zubret lied quickly. "Garion was just trying to get it out for me." Garion stood blushing furiously. "Really?" Aunt Paul said. "How interesting. Come with me, Garion." He started. "Now, Garion." And that was the end of that. Garion's time thereafter was totally occupied in the kitchen, and Aunt Paul's eyes seemed to be on him every moment. He mooned about a great deal and worried desperately about Dorum, who now appeared hatefully smug, but Aunt Paul remained watchful, and Garion remained in the kitchen. Oh, thank you very much. You're very welcome. I'm glad you're able to join us for this little book reading session. So we've been going for, I guess, coming up on 2 hours, pretty close, but I'm still really enjoying reading. I'm almost worse with this sort of thing than I am about singing. Like I love a good book, and I love this series. It's been probably 5 years or so since I've read it. Usually I read this series about once every year or two, but I've been kind of keeping myself occupied with other series. So it's been a while since I've come back to this. So I'm really enjoying this. You might find if you're not familiar with the series, the pace is very different from a lot of other fantasy novels. Like it definitely is a much slower paced series. Like there's a lot of high fantasy later on in it. A lot of like monsters and magic and other interesting grand stuff. But at every point along, there's always this kind of undercurrent of domesticity that I really like. It's very unique. At the time when I'd read this, I'd never really encountered that in another series. And I haven't seen it come up very often in other series since. So you really kind of get a sense of who the people in the story are beyond their roles in the grander scheme of things. You get to know them on a very personal, ordinary, everyday level, even the ones who are very sort of larger than life people during the major events in the book. So I really quite like that, but it's a different kind of pacing than you may be used to. So so bear with it. All right, we're gonna continue on with chapter 5. In mid-autumn that year, when the leaves had turned and the wind had showered them down from the trees like red and gold snow, when evenings were chill and the smoke from the chimneys at Falder's farm rose straight and blue toward the first cold stars in a purpling sky, Wolf returned. He came up the road one gusty afternoon under a lowering autumn sky, with the new-fallen leaves tumbling about him and his great dark cloak whipping in the wind. Garion, who'd been dumping kitchen slops to the pigs, saw his approach and ran to meet him. The old man seemed travel-stained and tired, and his face under his grey hood was grim. His usual demeanor of happy-go-lucky cheerfulness had been replaced by a somber mood Garion had never seen in him before. "Garion," Wolf said by way of greeting, "you've grown, I see." "It's been 5 years," Garion said. "Has it been so long?" Garion nodded, falling into step beside his friend. "Is everyone well?" Wolf asked. "Oh yes," Garion said. "Everything's the same here, except that Brella got married and moved away, and the old brown cow died last summer." "I remember the cow," Wolf said. Then he said, "I must speak with your Aunt Paul." "She's not in a very good mood today," Garion warned. "It might be better if you rested in one of the barns. I can sneak you some food and drink to you in a bit." "We'll have to chance her mood," Wolf said. "What I have to say to her can't wait." They entered the gate and crossed the courtyard to the kitchen door. Aunt Paul was waiting. "You again," she said tartly, her hands on her hips. "My kitchen still hasn't recovered from your last visit." "Mistress Paul," Wolf said, bowing. Then he did a strange thing. His fingers traced an intricate little design in the air in front of his chest. Garion was quite sure he wasn't intended to see those gestures. Aunt Paul's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed, and her face became grim. "How do you—" she started, then caught herself. "Garion," she said sharply, "I need some carrots. There's still some on the ground at the far end of the kitchen garden. Take a spade and a pail and fetch me some." "But," he protested, and then, warned by her expression, he left quickly. He got a spade and pail from a nearby shed, then loitered near the kitchen door. Eavesdropping, of course, was not a nice habit, and was considered the worst sort of bad manners in Sandaria. But Garion had long ago concluded that whenever he was sent away, the conversation was bound to be very interesting, and would probably concern him rather intimately. He'd wrestled briefly with his conscience about it, but since he really saw no harm in the practice, as long as he didn't repeat anything he heard, conscience had lost to curiosity. Garion's ears were very sharp, but it took him a moment or two to separate the two familiar voices from the other sounds of the kitchen. "He'll not leave you a trail," Aunt Paul was saying. "He doesn't have to," Wolf replied. "The thing itself will make its own trail known to me. I can follow it as easily as a fox can scent out the track of a rabbit." "Where will he take it?" she asked. "Who can say? His mind is closed to me. My guess is he'll go north to Boktor. That's the shortest route to Garg na Drak. He'll know that I'll be after him, and he'll want to cross into the land of the Angrak as soon as possible. His theft won't be complete as long as he stays in the west." "When did it happen?" 4 weeks ago. He could already be in the Angrat Kingdoms. That's not likely. The distances are great. But if he is, I'll have to follow him. I'll need your help. But how can I leave here? Aunt Paul asked. I have to watch over the boy. Garion's curiosity was becoming almost unbearable. He edged closer to the kitchen door. The boy will be safe enough here, Wolf said. This is an urgent matter. No, Aunt Paul contradicted. Even this place isn't safe. Last Aristide, a Murgo and 5 thalls came here. He posed as a merchant, but he asked a few too many questions about an old man and a boy named Runderig who had been seen in Upper Gralt some years ago. He may also have recognized me. It's more serious than I thought then, Wolf said thoughtfully. We'll have to move the boy. We can leave him with friends elsewhere. No, Aunt Paul disagreed again. If I go with you, he'll have to go along. He's reaching an age where he has to be watched most carefully. Don't be foolish, Wolf said sharply. Garion was stunned. Nobody talked to Aunt Paul that way. It's my decision to make, Aunt Paul said crisply. We all agreed that he was to be in my care until he was grown. I won't go unless he goes with me. Garion's heart leapt. Paul, Wolf said sharply, think where we may have to go. You can't deliver the boy into those hands. He'd be safer in Thal Murgos or in Meloria itself than he would be without me to watch him. Aunt Paul said, Last spring I caught him in the barn with a girl about his own age. As I said, he needs watching. Wolf laughed then, a rich, merry sound. Is that all? He said. You worry too much about such things. How would you like it if we returned and found him married and about to become a father? Aunt Paul demanded acidly. He'd make an excellent farmer. And what matter if we'd all have to wait 100 years for the circumstances to be right again? Surely it hasn't gone that far. They're only children. You're blind, old wolf, Aunt Paul said. This is Bat County Cinderia, and the boy's been raised to do the proper and honorable thing. The girl is a bright-eyed little minx who's maturing much too rapidly for my comfort. Right now, charming little Zubrette is a far greater danger than any Murgo could ever be. Either the boy goes along or I won't go either. You have your responsibilities, and I have mine. There's no time to argue, Wolf said. If it has to be that way, then so be it. Garion almost choked with excitement. He felt only a passing momentary pang at leaving Zubrette behind. He turned and looked exultantly up at the clouds scudding across the evening sky. And because his back was turned, he didn't see Aunt Paul approach the kitchen door. The garden, I recall, lies beyond the south wall, she pointed out. Garion started guiltily. How is it that the carrots remain undug? She demanded. I had to look for the spade, he said unconvincingly. Really? I see that you found it, however. Her eyebrows arched dangerously. Only just now. Splendid. Carrots, Garion. Now. Garion grabbed the spade and pail and ran. It was just dark when he returned, and he saw Aunt Paul mounting the steps that led to Faldor's quarters. He might have followed her to listen, but a faint movement in the dark doorway of one of the sheds made him step instead into the shadow of the gate. A furtive figure moved from the shed to the foot of the stairs Aunt Paul had just climbed, and silently crept up the stairs as soon as she went in Faldor's door. The light was fading, and Garion couldn't see exactly who followed his aunt. He set his pail down, and grasping the spade like a weapon, he hurried quickly around the inner court, keeping to the shadows. There came the sound of a movement inside the chambers upstairs, and the figure at the door straightened quickly and scurried down the steps. Garion slipped back out of sight, his spade still held at the ready. As the figure passed him, Garion briefly caught the scent of stale, musty clothing and rank sweat. As certainly as if he'd seen the man's face, he knew the figure that he had followed. He knew that the figure that had followed his aunt had been Brill, the new farmhand. The door at the top of the stairs opened, and Garion heard his aunt's voice. I'm sorry, Faldor, but it's a family matter, and I must leave immediately. I would pay you more, Paul. Faldor's voice was almost breaking. Money has nothing to do with it, Aunt Paul replied. You're a good man, Faldor, and your farm has been a haven to me when I needed one. I'm grateful to you, more than you can know, but I must leave. Perhaps when this family business is over, you can come back? Faldor almost pleaded. No, Faldor, she said. I'm afraid not. We'll miss you, Paul, Faldor said with tears in his voice. And I'll miss you, dear Faldor. I've never met a better-hearted man. I take it kindly if you wouldn't mention my leaving until I'm gone. I'm not fond of explanations or sentimental goodbyes. Whatever you wish, Paul. Don't look so mournful, old friend, Aunt Paul said lightly. My helpers are well trained. Their cooking will be the same as mine. Your stomach will never know the difference. My heart will, Faldor said. Don't be silly, she said gently. Now I must see to supper. Garion moved quickly from the foot of the stairs. Troubled, he put his spade back in the shed and fetched the pail of carrots he'd left sitting by the gate. To reveal to his aunt that he'd seen Brill listening at the door would immediately raise questions about his own activities that he'd prefer not to have to answer. In all probability, Brill was merely curious, and there was nothing menacing or ominous about that. To observe the unsavory Brill duplicating his own seemingly harmless pastime, however, made Garyon quite uncomfortable, even slightly ashamed of himself. Although Garyon was much too excited to eat, supper that evening seemed as ordinary as any meal on Faldor's farm had ever been. Garyon covertly watched sour-faced Brill, but the man showed no outward sign of having in any way been changed by the conversation he'd gone to so much trouble to overhear. When supper was over, as was always the case when he visited the farm, Mr. Wolf was prevailed upon to tell a story. He rose and stood for a moment, deep in thought, as the wind moaned in the chimney, and the torches flickered in their rings on the pillars in the hall. As all men know, he began, the Morags are no more, and the spirit of Mero weeps alone in the wilderness and wails among the moss-grown ruins of Maragor. But also, as all men know, the hills and streams of Maragor are heavy with the fine yellow gold. That gold, of course, was the cause of the destruction of the Morags. When a certain neighboring kingdom became aware of the gold, the temptation became too great, and the result, as it almost always is when gold is at issue between kingdoms, was war. The pretext for the war was the lamentable fact that the Morags were cannibals. While this habit is distasteful to civilized men, had there not been gold in Maragor, it might have been overlooked. The war, however, was inevitable, and the Morags were slain. But the spirit of Mera and the ghosts of all the slaughtered Morags remained in Maragor, as those who went into that haunted kingdom soon discovered. Now it chanced to happen that about that time there lived in the town of Muros in southern Sandaria 3 adventuresome men, and hearing of all that gold, they resolved to journey down into Maragor to claim their share of it. The men, as I said, were adventuresome and bold, and they scoffed at the ideas of ghosts. The journey was long, for it's many hundreds of leagues from Muros to the upper reaches of Maragor, but the smell of gold drew them on. And so it happened one dark and stormy night that they crept across the borders into Maragor, past the patrols that had been set to turn back just such as they. That nearby kingdom, having gone to all the expense and inconvenience of war, was quite naturally reluctant to share the gold with anyone who chanced to pass by. Through the night they crept, burning with their lust for gold. The spirit of Mera wailed about them, but they were brave men and not afraid of spirits, and besides, they told each other, the sound was not truly a spirit, but merely the moaning of the wind in the trees. As dim and misty morning seeped among the hills, they could hear not far away the rushing sound of a river. As all men know, gold is most easily found upon the banks of rivers, and so they made quickly toward that sound. Then one of them chanced to look down in the dim light, and behold, the ground at his feet was strewn with gold, lumps and chunks of it. Overcome with greed, he remained silent, and loitered behind until his companions were out of sight. Then he fell to his knees and began to gather up gold as a child might pick flowers. He heard a sound behind him, and he turned. What he saw it is best not to say. Dropping all his gold, he bolted. Now the river they had heard cut through a gorge just about there, and his 2 companions were amazed to see him run off the ledge of that gorge, and even continue to run as he fell, his legs churning insubstantial air. Then they turned and they saw what had been pursuing him. One went quite mad and leapt with a despairing cry into the same gorge which had just claimed his companion. But the third adventurer, the bravest and boldest of all, told himself that no ghost could actually hurt a living man, and stood his ground. That, of course, was the worst mistake of all. The ghosts encircled him as he stood bravely, certain that they could not hurt him. Mr. Wolf paused and drank briefly from his tankard. And then, the storyteller continued, because even ghosts can become hungry, they divided him up, and they ate him. Garyon's hair stood on end at the shocking conclusion of Wolf's tale, and he could sense the others at his table shuddering. It was not at all the kind of story they'd expected to hear. Dernick the smith, who was sitting nearby, had a perplexed expression on his plain face. Finally he spoke. "I wouldn't question the truth of your story for the world," he said to Wolf, struggling with the words. "But if they ate him, the ghosts, I mean, where did it go? I mean, if ghosts are insubstantial, as all men say they are, they don't have stomachs, do they? And what would they bite with?" Wolf's face grew sly and mysterious. He raised one finger as if he were about to make some cryptic reply to Dernick's puzzled expression, and then he suddenly began to laugh. Dernick looked annoyed at first, and then, rather sheepishly, he too began to laugh. Slowly the laughter spread as they all began to understand the joke. An excellent jest, old friend, Feldor said, laughing as hard as any of the others, and one from which much instruction may be gained. Greed is bad, but fear is worse, and the world is dangerous enough without cluttering it with imaginary hobgoblins. Trust Faldor to twist a good story into a moralistic sermon of some kind. True enough, good Faldor, Wolf said more seriously, but there are things in this world which cannot be explained away or dismissed with laughter. Brill, seated near the fire, had not joined in the laughter. I've never seen a ghost, he said sourly, nor ever met anyone who has, and I for one don't believe in any kind of magic or sorcery or such childishness. And he stood up and stamped out of the hall almost as if the story had been a kind of personal insult. Later, in the kitchen, when Aunt Paul was seeing to the cleaning up, and Wolf lounged against one of the work tables with a tankard of beer, Garion's struggle with his conscience finally came into the open. That dry interior voice informed him most pointedly that concealing what he'd seen was not merely foolish, but possibly dangerous as well. He set down the pot he was scrubbing and crossed to where they were. It might not be important, he said carefully, but this afternoon when I was coming back from the garden, I saw Brill following you, Aunt Paul. She turned and looked at him. Wolf set down his tankard. Go on, Garion, Aunt Paul said. It was when you went up to talk with Faldor, Garion explained. He waited until you'd gone up the stairs and Faldor had let you in. Then he sneaked up and listened at the door. I saw him up there when I went to put the spade away. How long has this man Brill been at the farm? Wolf asked, frowning. He came just last spring, Garion said, after Breldo got married and moved away. And the Murgo merchant was here at Aristide some months before? Aunt Paul looked at him sharply. You think... She didn't finish. I think it might not be a bad idea if I were to step around and have a few words with friend Brill, Wolf said grimly. Do you know where his room is, Garion? Garion nodded, his heart suddenly racing. Show me. Wolf moved away from the table against which he'd been lounging, and his step was no longer the step of an old man. It was curiously as if the years had suddenly dropped away from him. Be careful, Aunt Paul warned. Wolf chuckled, and the sound was chilling. I'm always careful. You should know that by now. Garion quickly led Wolf around into the yard, and around the far end where the steps mounted to the gallery that led to the rooms of the farmhands. They went up, their soft leather shoes making no sound on the worn steps. Down here, Garion whispered, not knowing exactly why he whispered. Wolf nodded, and they went quietly down the dark gallery. Here, Garion whispered, stopping. Step back, Wolf breathed. He touched the door with his fingertips. Is it locked? Garion asked. That's no problem, Wolf said softly. He put his hand to the latch. There was a click, and the door swung open. Wolf stepped inside with Garion close behind. It was totally dark in the room, and the sour stink of Brill's unwashed clothes hung in the air. He's not here, Wolf said in a normal tone. He fumbled with something at his belt, and there was a scrape of flint against steel and a flare of sparks. A wisp of frayed rope caught the sparks and began to glow. Wolf blew on the spark for a second, and it flared into flame. He raised the burning wisp over his head and looked around the empty room. The floor and bed were littered with rumpled clothes and personal belongings. Garion knew instantly that this was not simple untidiness, but rather was a sign of a hasty departure, and he didn't know exactly how it was that he knew. Wolf stood for a moment holding his little torch. His face seemed somehow empty, as if his mind were searching for something. The stables, he said sharply. Quickly, boy. Garion turned and dashed from the room with Wolf close behind. The burning wisp of rope drifted down into the yard, illuminating it briefly after Wolf discarded it over the railing as he ran. There was a light in the stable. It was dim, partially covered, but faint beams shone through the weathered cracks in the door. The horses were stirring uneasily. Stay clear, boy, Wolf said as he jerked the stable door open. Brill was inside, struggling to saddle a horse that shied from his rank smell. Leaving, Brill? Wolf asked, stepping into the doorway with his arms crossed. Brill turned quickly, crouched and with a snarl on his unshaven face. His off-center eye gleamed whitely in the half-muted light of the lantern hanging from a peg on one of the stalls, and his broken teeth shone behind his pulled-back lips. Strange time for a journey, Wolf said dryly. Don't interfere with me, old man, Brill said, his tone menacing. You'll regret it. I've regretted many things in my life, Wolf said. I doubt the one more will make that much difference. I warned you, Brill snarled, and his hand dove under his cloak and emerged with a short, rust-splotched sword. Don't be stupid, Wolf said in a tone of overwhelming contempt. Garion, however, at the first flash of the sword, whipped his hand to his belt, drew his dagger, and stepped in front of the unarmed old man. Get back, boy, Wolf barked. But Garion had already lunged forward, his bright dagger thrust out ahead of him. Later, when he had time to consider, he couldn't have explained why he reacted as he did. Some deep instinct seemed to take over. Garion, Wolf said, get out of the way. So much the better, Brill said, raising his sword. And then Dernick was there. He appeared as if from nowhere, snatched up an ox yoke and struck the sword from Brill's hand. Brill turned on him, enraged, and Dernick's second blow took the cast-eyed man in the ribs, a little below the armpit. The breath whooshed from Brill's lungs, and he collapsed, gasping and writhing to the straw-littered floor. For shame, Garyon, Dernick said reproachfully. I didn't make that knife of yours for this kind of thing. He was going to kill Mr. Wolf, Garyon protested. Never mind that, Wolf said, bending over the gasping man on the floor of the stable. He searched Brill roughly and pulled a jingling purse up from under the stained tunic. He carried the purse to the lantern and opened it. That's mine, Brill gasped, trying to rise. Dernick raised the ox yoke, and Brill sank back again. Sizable sum for an ordinary farmhand to have, friend Brill, Wolf said, pouring the jingling coins from the purse into his hand. How did you manage to come by it? Brill glared at him. Garyon's eyes grew wide at the sight of the coins. He'd never seen gold before. You don't really need to answer, friend Brill, Wolf said, examining one of the coins. Your gold speaks for you. He dumped the coins back into the purse and tossed the small leather pouch back to the man on the floor. Brill grabbed it quickly and pushed it back inside his tunic. I'll have to tell Falder of this, Dernick said. No, Wolf said. It's a serious matter, said Dernick. A bit of wrestling or a few blows exchanged is one thing, but drawing weapons is quite another. There's no time for all of that, Wolf said, taking a piece of harness strap from a peg on the wall. Bind his hands behind him and we'll put him in one of the grain bins. Someone will find him in the morning. Dernick stared at him. Trust me, good Dernick, Wolf said. The matter is urgent. Bind him and hide him someplace, then come to the kitchen. Come with me, Garyon. And he turned and left the stable. Aunt Paul was pacing her kitchen nervously when they returned. Well, she demanded. He was attempting to leave, Wolf said. We stopped him. Did you... She left it hanging. No, he drew a sword, but Dernick chanced to be nearby and knocked the belligerence out of him. The intervention was timely. Your cub here was about to do battle. That little dagger of his is a pretty thing, but not really much of a match for a sword. Aunt Paul turned on Garyon, her eyes ablaze. Garyon prudently stepped back out of reach. There's no time for that, Wolf said, retrieving the tankard he'd set down before leaving the kitchen. Brill had a pouch full of good red Angarat gold. The Murgos have set eyes to watching this place. I'd wanted to make our going less noticeable, but since we're already being watched, there's no point in that now. Gather what you and the boy will need. I want a few leagues between us and Brill before he manages to free himself. I don't want to be looking over my shoulder for Murgos every place I go. Dernick, who'd just come into the kitchen, stopped and stood staring at them. Things aren't what they seem here, he said. What manner of folk are you, and how is it that you have such dangerous enemies? That's a long story, good Dernick, Wolf said, but I'm afraid there's no time to tell it now. Make our apologies to Falder and see if you can't detain Brill for a day or so. I'd like our trail to be quite cold before he and his friends try to find it. Someone else is going to have to do that, Dernick said slowly. I'm not sure what this is all about, but I am sure that there's danger involved in it. It appears I'll have to go with you, at least until I've gotten you safely away from here. Aunt Paul suddenly laughed. You, Dernick, you mean to protect us? He drew himself up. I'm sorry, Mistress Paul, he said. I will not permit you to go unescorted. Will not permit, she said incredulously. Very well, Wolf said, a sly look on his face. Have you totally taken leave of your senses? Aunt Paul demanded, turning on him. Dernick has shown himself to be a useful man, Wolf said. If nothing else, he'll give me someone to talk with along the way. Your tongue has grown sharper with the years, Paul, and I don't relish the idea of 100 leagues or more with nothing but abuse for companionship. I see that you have finally slipped into your dotage, old Wolf, she said acidly. That's exactly the sort of thing I meant, Wolf replied blandly. Now gather a few necessary things and let's be away from here. The night's passing rapidly. She glared at him a moment and then stormed out of the kitchen. I'll have to fetch some things too, Dernick said. He turned and went out into the gusty night. Garyon's mind whirled. Things were happening far too fast. Afraid, boy? Wolf asked. Well, Garyon said, it's just, I don't understand. I don't understand any of this at all. You will in time, Garyon, Wolf said. For now, it's perhaps better that you don't. There's danger in what we're doing, but not all that great a danger. Your aunt and I, and good Dernick, of course, will see no harm comes to you. Now help me in the pantry. He took a lantern into the pantry and began loading some loaves of bread, a ham, a round yellow cheese, and several bottles of wine into a sack which he took down from a peg. It was nearly midnight, as closely as Garyon could tell, when they quietly left the kitchen and crossed the dark courtyard. The faint creak of the gate as Dernick swung it open seemed enormously loud. As they passed through the gate, Garyon felt a momentary pang. Valdor's farm had been the only home he had ever known. He was leaving now, perhaps forever, and such things held great significance. He felt an even sharper pang at the memory of Zubret. The thought of Dorun and Zubret together in the hay barn almost made him want to give the whole thing up altogether, but it was far too late now. Beyond the protection of the buildings, the gusty wind was chill and whipped at Garian's cloak. Heavy clouds covered the moon, and the road seemed only slightly less dark than the surrounding fields. It was cold and lonely, and more than a little frightening. He walked a bit closer to Aunt Paul. At the top of the hill he stopped and glanced back. Valdor's farm was only a pale, dim blur in the valley behind. Regretfully he turned his back on it. The valley ahead was very dark, and even the road was lost in the gloom before them. Thus ends Chapter 5, and I'm thinking thus ends our reading session for tonight. We've been going, let's see, about a little over 2 hours, and my voice is starting to get tired, and I'm starting to get kind of hungry, so we're going to wrap it up there. But thank you all for joining me for this this first little live streaming book reading session. If you guys enjoyed it, leave me a comment and let me know if you want to keep going, if you want to do more of these, if you want me to keep reading with this book, or if you prefer something else. I'm open to suggestions. So give me some feedback and we'll reassess for more. So y'all have a good night, and I will catch you later. Cheers.